There is a stillness that settles over the land when the sun begins its slow descent, a particular kind of quiet that seems to rise from the earth itself. And in that quiet, there is memory, long before the arrival of tall ships with canvas sails, long before the drawing of borders or the naming of states. This continent breathed with the rhythm of countless peoples, each tribe, each nation, each community woven into the vast tapestry of what would one day be called North America, but what was then simply home. The land itself tells stories, if one knows how to listen, stories written in the curves of ancient rivers, in the shadows of mountain ranges that have watched over valleys for millennia, in the wind that moves through prairie grass, the way it has moved for thousands upon thousands of years, from the frozen reaches of the Arctic, where ice meets sky in an endless communion of white and blue, down through forests so dense that sunlight filters through the canopy in thin golden threads, across plains that stretch beyond the horizon like a great breathing sea of earth and grass, to the southwestern deserts where stone formations rise like cathedrals built by time itself. The indigenous peoples of this continent created civilizations as diverse as the landscapes they inhabited. There is something profoundly humbling about imagining the span of human presence here, not in hundreds of years, but in thousands, not in single lifetimes, but in generations stacked upon generations like layers of sediment, each one leaving its marks, its wisdom, its way of understanding the world. The ancestral Puebloans built cities into cliffsides, stone dwellings that seemed to grow from the rock itself, rooms stacked like honeycomb, each one carefully positioned to catch the winter sun or offer shade in the brutal heat of summer. These were not simple shelters. They were architectural achievements that spoke of sophisticated understanding, of astronomy, of engineering, of community organization on a scale that required cooperation and shared vision. In the Ohio River Valley, the Hopewell peoples raised earthworks of such geometric precision that they still inspire wonder today. Great mounds rising from flat ground, some shaped like animals when viewed from above. Others arranged in perfect circles and octagons, aligned with celestial events, the equinoxes, the solstices, markers of time and ceremony that connected the people to the movements of sun and moon and stars. The Haudenosaunee, known also as the Iroquois Confederacy, developed a system of governance so thoughtful, so balanced in its approach to collective decision-making, that it would later influence democratic principles far beyond their original territory. The great law of peace, a constitution held in memory and passed through oral tradition, spoke of unity among different nations, of checks and balances, of the importance of consensus and the responsibility to consider 7 generations into the future when making decisions that would affect the people. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, where mountains meet ocean and rivers thick with salmon cut through ancient forests, the peoples there, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and so many others, created art of stunning complexity. Totem poles that stood as family histories carved in cedar, each figure, each symbol carrying meaning that connected the present to ancestors, to clans, to stories of transformation and power. And in the southeast, the Mississippian culture built Cahokia, a city that at its peak, around the year 1100, held a population larger than London at the same time, with great plazas, residential districts, and a massive earthen pyramid, Monk's Mound, that still stands today, rising in terraced levels, a monument to the organizational capacity and vision of a people who understood urban planning, agriculture on a vast scale, and the movement of goods through trade networks that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of miles. These were not isolated achievements, not scattered moments of brilliance in an otherwise empty land. They were part of a living, breathing mosaic of human culture, each tribe, each nation developing its own languages, its own stories, its own methods of passing knowledge from the old to the young, its own relationship with the specific place it called home. The land shaped the people, and the people shaped the land. In the arid Southwest, where water was precious as gold, irrigation systems channeled every possible drop to fields of corn and beans and squash. The three sisters planted together in a symbiosis that enriched the soil and maximized yield. In the Great Plains, the presence of vast bison herds influenced everything, from diet to clothing to spiritual practice, entire economies, entire ways of life built around the movement of these great animals across grasslands that seemed to extend forever and always woven through everything was a sense of connection to place, to ancestors, to the future generations yet unborn, understanding that the people were not separate from the world around them, but part of it, bound to it in ways both practical and profound. As twilight deepens and the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, one can almost sense the presence of all those who came before, all those hands that shaped stone and wood, all those voices that sang songs now mostly forgotten, all those minds that looked up at these same stars and found in them patterns, stories, guidance for planting and harvest. For ceremony and celebration, the story begins, as all stories do, in a time so distant that it exists now only in fragments, in artifacts pulled from earth, in the patient work of archaeologists who brush away centuries of soil grain by grain, in the oral traditions passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, each retelling an act of preservation. The first peoples arrived on this continent in waves, migrations that unfolded over thousands of years, crossing from Asia across a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, a bridge that existed during the ice ages when so much of the world's water was locked in glaciers that sea levels dropped, revealing a passage, a corridor of land now drowned beneath the Bering Strait. This was not a single journey, not one tribe making one crossing, but rather a slow movement of peoples over millennia, some walking across the exposed land, others perhaps following the coastline in boats, fishing, hunting marine mammals, moving ever southward along the Pacific shore. And as they moved, they adapted, they changed. They became the ancestors of all the indigenous nations that would eventually populate 2 entire continents. The dating of these migrations has shifted over time as new evidence emerges, but the archaeological record suggests human presence in North America, stretching back at least 15,000 years, perhaps longer, perhaps much longer. Stone tools found at certain sites hint at occupation that predates the last glacial maximum, suggesting a human story on this continent that extends back into a past almost impossibly distant. And as these early peoples spread across the land, they encountered environments of stunning variety. Some groups moved into the interior, following game animals across tundra and grassland, pursuing mammoth and giant bison and camels. Yes, Camels once roamed North America. Along with horses, both would later go extinct on this continent, only to be reintroduced by Europeans thousands of years after their disappearance. The Clovis people, named for the distinctive spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico, represent one of the earliest widespread cultures. Their characteristic stone points, carefully flaked and shaped, have been found across much of North America. Dating to roughly 13,000 years ago, these were sophisticated tools, evidence of skill and knowledge passed from master to apprentice, from parent to child. But the Clovis were not alone, not the only people present during this period. Other cultures existed alongside them, or perhaps before them. The debate continues. The Folsom culture followed, their points smaller, more refined, adapted for hunting the bison that increasingly dominated the plains as the great ice sheets retreated and the megafauna of the Pleistocene era gradually disappeared. Climate change shaped everything in these early millennia. As the world warmed, as glaciers melted and retreated northward, the very landscape transformed. Forests spread where once there had been open tundra. Lakes formed in depressions left by ice. Rivers carved new channels through land freed from its frozen burden. And the peoples adapted, always adapted, changing their tools, their hunting strategies, their entire way of life to match the changing world. In the East, as forests grew thick with oak and hickory and pine, peoples developed what archaeologists call the archaic tradition, a way of life less focused on hunting large game, more diverse in its approach to obtaining food. They gathered nuts and berries. They fished in streams and rivers. They hunted smaller animals, deer and turkey and rabbit. They began to develop more permanent settlements, returning to the same locations season after season, leaving behind middens, refuse, heaps that would tell modern researchers what they ate, how they lived, the rhythm of their year. Some of the earliest evidence of plant cultivation in North America comes from this period, not the full-scale agriculture that would come later, but the careful tending of certain plants, the selection of seeds from the most productive specimens, the gradual, patient, almost invisible transformation of wild plants into domesticated varieties. Squash was among the first, then sunflowers, then various native grains. In the river valleys of the southeast, communities began to flourish around 4,000 years ago. The Poverty Point culture, in what is now Louisiana, created earthworks of remarkable scale and complexity, concentric semicircular ridges, each one precisely aligned, covering an area of more than 400 acres. This required coordination, planning, a social structure capable of organizing labor on a massive scale. And this was happening thousands of years before the pyramids of Mesoamerica, thousands of years before European contact. The peoples of Poverty Point traded across vast distances, bringing in copper from the Great Lakes region, stone for tool making from sources hundreds of miles away. They created small clay figurines, objects whose purpose remains mysterious, ritual items perhaps, or toys, or teaching tools. The past does not always reveal its secrets clearly. As centuries accumulated into millennia, distinct regional cultures emerged, shaped by the specific environments they inhabited. In the arid Southwest, the Cochise culture developed strategies for survival in a landscape where water was scarce and the sun beat down with relentless intensity. They gathered desert plants, mesquite beans, cactus fruits. They hunted desert bighorn sheep and rabbits, and gradually they began to cultivate corn, a crop that had been domesticated far to the south in Mesoamerica, and slowly, over generations, made its way northward through trade and migration. The introduction of corn, or maize, represented a transformation as significant as any in the history of the continent. It was a crop that could be stored, that could sustain larger populations, that could be planted in quantity and tended communally, and wherever it took hold, it changed the possibilities of life, allowed for the growth of settlements, the development of more complex social structures, the creation of surplus that could support specialists, artisans, priests, leaders who did not need to spend every waking hour in the direct pursuit of food. In the Ohio River Valley, around 3,000 years ago, the Adena culture began building burial mounds, earthen structures that served as ceremonial centers and final resting places for their dead. Some of these mounds were simple, others elaborate, containing grave goods, copper bracelets and gorgets, shells brought from the Gulf Coast, mica cut into intricate shapes, evidence of trade networks and belief systems that valued certain materials, certain forms, certain ways of honoring those who had passed from this world. The Adena gave way to, or perhaps evolved into, the Hopewell culture, which flourished roughly 2,000 years ago and expanded the tradition of mound building to heights of geometric sophistication that still inspire wonder. At Newark, Ohio, the Hopewell constructed earthworks covering more than 4 square miles, circles and octagons connected by avenues, aligned with lunar cycles, the major standstill of the moon, an 18.6-year cycle. These were people who watched the sky with deep attention, who understood celestial mechanics, who embedded that understanding in the very earth. The Hopewell trade network stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from Yellowstone, shells from the Gulf, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, all flowing along rivers and ancient trails to the ceremonial centers of the Ohio Valley, where artisans transformed these raw materials into objects of stunning beauty, copper birds and serpents hammered into thin sheets, mica cut into the shapes of human hands, bear claws, talons. And while the Hopewell built their earthworks in the east, in the southwest, the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples were making their own transition from a mobile hunting and gathering life to one increasingly centered on agriculture and permanent villages. The basket maker culture, named for their exceptional skill in weaving, created the foundation for what would become the ancestral Puebloan civilization. They lived in pit houses at first, dwellings partially excavated into the earth, with roofs of wood and mud rising above ground level. These houses clustered together in small villages, and the people grew corn and squash and beans. They wove baskets so tightly they could hold water. They created sandals from yucca fiber. They buried their dead with care, with offerings, with objects meant to accompany them on whatever journey lay beyond. Around the year 700 or 800, a shift occurred. The basket maker peoples began building above-ground structures of stone and adobe, pueblos, apartment-like complexes that could house dozens or even hundreds of people. This was the beginning of the Puebloan tradition, a way of life that would produce some of the most remarkable architecture in ancient North America, cliff dwellings tucked into canyon walls, great houses rising multiple stories, kivas, circular ceremonial chambers sunk into the earth, each one a connection point between the world above and the world below. Water management became central to survival in the arid Southwest. The people built check dams and terraces to slow runoff and allow water to sink into the soil. They created irrigation ditches to guide precious moisture to their fields. They developed dry farming techniques that coaxed crops from land that seemed too harsh to sustain anything green and growing. And through it all, they watched the sky, marked the solstices and equinoxes, knew exactly when the sun would strike a particular point on a cliff face or shine through a carefully positioned window, telling them when to plant, when to prepare for ceremony, when to gather for community observance of the cycles that governed all life. In the great river valleys of the Mississippi and its tributaries, a different kind of civilization was emerging, one that would build the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, a metropolis that rivaled the great urban centers of medieval Europe in both size and sophistication. Cahokia rose from the floodplains near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, a location chosen with strategic brilliance, where trade routes converged like threads meeting at a loom, where rich bottomland soil promised abundant harvests, where the rivers themselves served as highways connecting distant regions, bringing goods and ideas and people from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The city's growth accelerated around the year 1000, and within a century, perhaps 10,000 people lived within the urban core, with another 20,000 or more in the surrounding communities. Imagine the sound of such a place, the voices of thousands speaking, trading, arguing, laughing, the rhythmic pounding of corn being ground in mortars, the crack of stone tools shaping wood, the cries of children playing in the plazas, the chants rising from ceremonial gatherings. At the heart of Cahokia stood Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid built in stages over decades, perhaps centuries, rising in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet, covering more than 14 acres at its base, larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was not simply a pile of earth. Each basket of soil was carried and placed with intention, layer upon layer, compacted and shaped, the labor of thousands of people working together toward a collective vision. Atop the highest terrace stood a massive building, a temple or palace or both, where the elite conducted ceremonies, where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made, where the sacred and the political intertwined in ways that seem foreign to modern sensibilities, but were fundamental to Mississippian culture. The chief was not merely a political leader. He was a connection point between the people and the cosmos, between the earthly realm and the spiritual. His power derived from his ability to maintain balance, to ensure the sun continued its journey, the crops continued to grow, the world continued to function as it should. Surrounding Monk's Mound, the city spread out in a planned arrangement that spoke of sophisticated urban design, residential neighborhoods, craft production areas, elite compounds, and more than 100 smaller mounds, some serving as platforms for important buildings, others as burial sites for the honored dead. The entire complex was oriented to the cardinal directions, aligned with solar and lunar events, a city built not just for practical purposes, but as a reflection of cosmological order. The Grand Plaza stretched out from Monk's Mound, a vast open space where thousands could gather for ceremonies, for games, for the communal events that bound the population together. Archaeologists have found evidence of a massive pole structure and a circle of tall wooden posts, now called woodhenge, positioned to mark the solstices and equinoxes, a calendar built into the landscape itself, telling the people when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for the turning of seasons. Cahokia's influence extended far beyond its immediate vicinity. The distinctive shell-tempered pottery of the Mississippian culture, the platform mounds, the entire complex of symbols and practices spread up and down the river valleys. Communities from Wisconsin to Louisiana adopted elements of Cahokian culture, built their own mounds, participated in trade networks that brought marine shells from the Gulf, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, galena for pigments, exotic stones for ceremonial objects. In the southeast, Mississippian culture manifested in dozens of chiefdoms, each centered on a mound complex, each controlling a territory and its resources. Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in Oklahoma, these were not colonies of Cahokia, but rather independent polities that shared a common cultural framework, a way of organizing society that proved remarkably successful for centuries. The people of these chiefdoms were farmers first and foremost. They cleared river bottomlands and planted corn in fields that stretched for miles. They understood crop rotation, the importance of letting land lie fallow, the relationship between the flooding of rivers and the renewal of soil fertility. They supplemented their diet with fish from the rivers, deer from the forests, wild plants gathered according to the seasons, nuts stored against the winter, berries dried in the summer sun. But they were also artists of exceptional skill, creating pottery with elaborate designs, incised and painted, representing serpents and birds and human figures, symbols whose meanings were embedded in stories and ceremonies, shell gorgets carved with intricate iconography, the weeping eye motif, the forked eye, images of falcons and woodpeckers, creatures that moved between earth and sky, between the human world and the realm of spirits. The southeastern ceremonial complex, sometimes called the Southern Cult, united these dispersed chiefdoms through shared symbols and beliefs, a religious system that emphasized warfare, sacrifice, the sun as a divine force, the importance of maintaining cosmic balance through ritual, copper plates hammered into shapes depicting warriors in elaborate regalia, dancers with wings, beings that were part human, part animal, part divine. Meanwhile, far to the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were reaching their own cultural flowering at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Between the years 1000 and 1150, a remarkable complex emerged. Great houses built of precisely cut sandstone, multi-storied structures containing hundreds of rooms. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, rose at 4 or even 5 stories in places, its walls carefully aligned with solar and lunar events, windows positioned to catch the light at significant moments in the calendar. The construction of these great houses required incredible effort. Trees for roof beams were cut in distant mountains and carried for 50 miles or more, tens of thousands of timbers, each one shaped and placed with care. The stone walls were not simply piled rocks, but carefully coursed masonry. Some walls featured a core and veneer technique that created a distinctive pattern, practical and beautiful at once. Chaco served as a ceremonial center, not a city in the way Cahokia was a city, but rather a gathering place. People came from outlying communities along roads that stretched for miles across the desert, roads far wider than necessary for foot traffic, some nearly 30 feet across, running in almost perfectly straight lines, climbing stairs cut into cliff faces rather than taking easier routes around. These were not simply paths, but ceremonial ways, routes of pilgrimage and procession. Within the great houses, kivas offered spaces for ceremony and community gathering. The great kiva at Kettle measured more than 60 feet in diameter, sunk deep into the earth, its floor features and wall niches arranged according to principles both practical and symbolic. Here, in the firelight, stories were told, songs were sung, rituals were performed that connected the people to their ancestors, to the spirits of place, to the forces that governed rain and harvest and the continuation of life. The ancestral Puebloans developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. At Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon, 3 stone slabs lean against the cliff face in such a way that, at the summer solstice, a dagger of light pierces through a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock, marking the longest day. At the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light bracket the spiral, and at the equinoxes, a different pattern emerges. This was not accident, but design, the careful observation of generations encoded in stone and shadow. Water management remained central to survival. The people built check dams and terraces throughout the canyon, creating gardens in every possible location, channeling runoff from the cliff faces, making use of every drop of moisture in a land where rain was precious and unreliable. They grew corn adapted to short growing seasons and drought, beans that fixed nitrogen in the soil, squash that shaded the ground and helped retain moisture. Trade connected Chaco to distant regions, macaw feathers from Mexico, copper bells, shells from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast, cacao. Turquoise moved in the opposite direction, mined from deposits near Santa Fe and worked into beads and pendants and inlays, thousands upon thousands of pieces, some destined for local use, others traveling south into Mexico along trade routes that had existed for centuries. To the north and west, in the cliffs and canyons of what is now Colorado and Utah, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings of haunting beauty, Mesa Verde, Cañon de Chelly, Betatacan, structures tucked into natural alcoves in the cliff faces, protected from the elements, defensible if needed, but also positioned to catch the winter sun and stay cool in summer, the architecture responding to environment with elegant efficiency. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde contained more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas, built sometime around the year 1200, its walls rising in tiers within the natural alcove, like an apartment complex fitted perfectly into the curve of stone. To reach these dwellings, the people climbed ladders, carved hand and foot, holds into the cliff faces, pathways that required knowledge and skill that kept the community safe and separate from the canyon floor far below. Life in these cliff dwellings followed the rhythms of season and ceremony. Women ground corn on matots, worn smooth by generations of use. Men hunted deer and rabbits in the surrounding forests. Children learned the stories that explained where the people came from, where they were going, how to live in balance with a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Elders passed down knowledge of plant medicines, of weather signs, of the proper ways to conduct ceremonies, of kinship obligations and clan responsibilities. The people painted designs on their pottery, black on white, geometric patterns that varied from region to region, from generation to generation, allowing modern archaeologists to trace the movement of ideas, of people, of trade goods across the landscape. They wove baskets and sandals, cotton cloth on looms. They created turquoise and shell jewelry. They lived lives that were rich in meaning even when material resources were limited. And through all of this, whether in the great cities of the Mississippi Valley or the cliff dwellings of the Southwest, whether among the Hopewell Mound builders or the emerging cultures of the Great Plains, there ran a common thread, a way of understanding the world that saw everything as connected: the land, the sky, the animals, the plants, the living, the dead, the yet to be born, all part of a great web of relationship and responsibility. The Great Plains stretched across the heart of the continent like an ocean of grass, vast beyond imagining, rippling in waves under winds that blew unobstructed for hundreds of miles. And here, the peoples who made this landscape their home developed ways of life shaped entirely by the presence of one animal, the American bison, before the arrival of horses, before the transformation that would come with European contact. The Plains peoples hunted bison on foot, using knowledge passed down through countless generations. They understood the animal's behavior, their seasonal movements, the routes they took between summer and winter grazing grounds. This knowledge was survival, was sustenance, was the foundation of everything. The buffalo jump, or pishkun, represented one of the most sophisticated hunting techniques developed anywhere in the world. The people would guide a herd toward a cliff edge, using stone cairns and strategically placed scouts, gradually funneling the animals toward the precipice, and at the crucial moment, the herd would stampede, running over the edge, falling to their deaths or injury below, where waiting hunters would finish what the fall had begun. Head smashed in. Buffalo jump in present-day Alberta has been used for nearly 6,000 years. The bones at the base of the cliff piled meters deep, evidence of successful hunts stretching back into a past so distant it defies easy comprehension. Each hunt required precise coordination, knowledge of wind and weather, understanding of bison psychology, the ability to work together toward a common goal. Failure meant hunger. Success meant abundance, meat dried into pemmican that could sustain the people through harsh winters, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread and bowstrings, horns for ladles and ceremonial objects. The peoples of the plains, the Blackfoot, the Crow, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, the Comanche, and so many others, developed cultures of remarkable richness, despite or perhaps because of the challenging environment, summers of scorching heat, winters of bitter cold, storms that could appear with terrifying suddenness, blizzards that could disorient and kill, tornadoes that tore across the landscape, hail that could flatten crops and bruise skin. They lived in teepees, conical structures of hide stretched over wooden poles, designs that could be erected quickly, taken down just as fast, moved as the people followed game or sought better grazing for their dogs. Yes, dogs, the only domesticated animals available before horses arrived. Dogs that pulled travois, that helped with hunts, that warned of danger, that were companions and workers, and sometimes, in times of desperation, Food, the sun dance, one of the most important ceremonies of Plains cultures, brought communities together in observance that lasted for days. Dancers sought visions through fasting and physical ordeal, piercing their skin and tethering themselves to a central pole. Dancing until exhaustion or vision, or both, brought them to the edge of the ordinary world, allowing them to glimpse something beyond, to receive guidance, to sacrifice their comfort for the good of the people. In the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the League of Peace and Power, united 5 nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, into a political alliance of such sophistication that it would later inspire observers from Europe and influence the thinking of those who would eventually draft the Constitution of the United States. The Confederacy formed sometime before European contact. The exact date lost to time, but the story preserved in oral tradition. Deganawida, the great peacemaker, and Hiawatha united the warring nations under the great law of peace, symbolized by the white pine, its needles growing in clusters of 5, representing the 5 nations, and above the tree, an eagle watching in all directions, vigilant against threats to the peace. Decision-making in the Confederacy followed careful protocols. Matters moved from the Mohawk and Seneca, the younger brothers, to the Oneida and Cayuga, and finally to the Onondaga, the firekeepers, who held the central position. Consensus was the goal, not simple majority rule, but true agreement. Discussion continued until unity could be achieved, or the matter was set aside to be revisited when emotions had cooled and new perspectives might emerge. Women held significant power in Haudenosaunee society. The clan mothers selected the sachems, the peace chiefs, and could remove them if they failed in their duties. Women controlled the longhouses, those massive bark-covered structures that could house entire extended families, 30 or 40 or even 50 people living together under one roof, organized by clan, by maternal lineage. Property and status passed through the female line. Children belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's. The longhouses themselves could stretch for over 100 feet, sometimes much longer, a series of compartments along a central corridor, each compartment home to a nuclear family, but the building functioning as a single unit, fires burning down the center, smoke holes in the roof, racks for drying corn, storage pits dug into the floor, the physical structure reflecting the social structure, individual families within the larger unity of clan and nation. Agriculture provided the foundation for Haudenosaunee life. The 3 sisters again, corn and beans and squash planted together in mounds, the corn stalks providing support for the beans fixing nitrogen, the squash leaves shading the soil and discouraging weeds. This was not merely farming, but a sophisticated understanding of plant ecology, of how different species could support one another, create more abundance together than any could alone. The fields belonged to the women, who planted and tended and harvested, while men hunted and fished and engaged in diplomacy and warfare. This division of labor was not rigid but generally observed, and it gave women economic power, control over food supplies, the ability to support or withhold support from military ventures. Peace and war were not solely the province of men when women controlled the sustenance that made either possible. To the far north, where winters stretched long and dark, where ice dominated the landscape for much of the year, The Inuit peoples developed ways of life adapted to conditions that seem almost impossibly harsh. They hunted seal through breathing holes in the ice, waiting for hours in temperatures far below freezing, perfectly still, perfectly patient, listening for the sound of a seal surfacing to breathe, and striking with harpoons in that brief moment of opportunity. They hunted whales, bowhead whales that could weigh 60 tons, hunting them from umiaks, boats made of walrus hide stretched over wooden frames, the hunt requiring perfect coordination, strength, courage, and luck. A successful whale hunt meant abundance for the entire community, meat and blubber for food, bones for tools and structural elements, baleen for fishing line and snares, oil for lamps that provided light through the months of darkness. The Inuit built snow houses, igloos, cutting blocks of packed snow and arranging them in a rising spiral, creating a dome that could withstand fierce winds, that trapped heat efficiently, that could be constructed in a few hours when traveling across the winter landscape. These were not crude shelters, but engineered structures that made survival possible in one of the most extreme environments humans have ever inhabited. They also built sod houses for more permanent settlements, using whale bones for roof supports, covering the frame with layers of sod that provided insulation against cold and wind. These houses were partially underground, entered through a long tunnel that kept the wind from blowing directly into the living space. Inside, families gathered around oil lamps, telling stories through the long dark, carving ivory and bone, sewing warm clothing from caribou hide and seal skin, maintaining the knowledge and skills that allowed them to thrive where others would perish. Along the northwest coast, from what is now Alaska down through British Columbia and into Washington and Oregon, the peoples there developed cultures of stunning artistic achievement, supported by the incredible abundance of salmon and other marine resources. The forests provided massive cedar trees that could be split and carved and shaped into houses, into canoes, into totem poles that stood as family histories and declarations of status. The potlatch ceremony, central to Northwest Coast cultures, involved the giving away of vast quantities of goods, blankets, food, carved objects, copper shields, the host demonstrating a wealth not by hoarding but by generosity, by the ability to give more than others could give. These were not simply parties but complex social events that validated claims to hereditary rights, that resolved disputes, that redistributed resources from the wealthy to the entire community. Totem poles rose before the great plank houses, each figure telling part of a story, a lineage, a claim to connection with supernatural beings. The carving of these poles required skill passed from master to apprentice over years of training. The raising of a pole was ceremony and celebration, the pole itself a declaration visible to all, permanent, public, embodying in cedar the stories that words alone could not fully capture. And yet, by the 13th and 14th centuries, changes were rippling across the continent. Cahokia, the great metropolis of the Mississippi, was declining, perhaps because the population had grown too large for the surrounding land to support, perhaps because climate change brought drought and instability, perhaps because political power became too centralized, too distant from the people. The reasons remain debated, but the result was clear. The city emptied, people dispersed, returned to smaller communities. The mounds remained, but the great urban experiment ended. In the southwest, similar abandonments occurred. Chaco Canyon was largely empty by the year 1200. Mesa Verde by 1300, the cliff dwellings so carefully built, so perfectly positioned, left behind. The people moved, some to the Rio Grande Valley, some to what is now Arizona. They did not vanish, but rather relocated, adapted, continued in new places the traditions developed in the old. These movements, these changes, were part of a larger pattern that had always characterized indigenous life in North America: adaptation, flexibility, the ability to change when change was necessary. These were not static societies frozen in time, but living cultures that responded to shifting conditions, that made choices, that succeeded and sometimes failed and tried again. By the time the first Europeans began to arrive in significant numbers, the indigenous peoples of North America had already experienced millennia of change, of cultural flowering and decline, of adaptation to climate shifts and resource fluctuations, of trade and warfare and alliance, of artistic achievement and technological innovation. They were not living fossils from some distant past, but the inheritors of deep traditions, sophisticated cultures, complex understandings of their world. The land held the memory of all of it: the earthworks in Ohio, the cliff dwellings in the canyons, the shell middens along the coasts, the stone circles on the plains, each one a testament to human presence, to the long story of peoples who had made this continent home for so many thousands of years, who had shaped it and been shaped by it, who belonged to it in ways that went deeper than any document or deed could express. And in that belonging, in that deep-rootedness, there lived an understanding that the modern world has largely forgotten, the understanding that humans are not separate from nature, not masters standing above and apart, but participants, relatives, members of a community that includes the four-legged and the winged, the plants and the stones, the rivers and the rain. The languages of indigenous peoples carried this understanding in their very structure. In Lakota, the word for relatives, Mitakuye Oyasin, means all my relations, Malta, and it refers not just to human kin, but to everything, the entire web of life. When spoken in ceremony, it acknowledges connection, responsibility, the truth that what affects one affects all, that there can be no separation between the well-being of the people and the well-being of the land. This was not sentiment but practical wisdom, tested and refined over thousands of years. The peoples who survived, who thrived, were those who understood the limits of their environment, who did not take more than could be replenished, who watched the animal populations and adjusted their hunting accordingly, who allowed fields to rest, who moved when staying would deplete the resources beyond recovery. The seasonal round followed by many tribes embody this wisdom, moving to different locations throughout the year, fishing when the salmon ran, gathering berries when they ripened, hunting in seasons of plenty, each movement allowing the land to recover, preventing the kind of concentrated impact that comes from permanent settlement. This was not wandering aimlessly, but rather a carefully orchestrated relationship with place, intimate knowledge of dozens or even hundreds of square miles, knowing where each plant grew, when each animal would appear, reading the land like a text written in stone and soil and living things. Ceremony wove through everything, marking the transitions, the first salmon, the first corn, the harvest, the hunt, ceremonies of gratitude, of request, of renewal. These were not optional extras, decorative elements added to the serious business of survival. They were the serious business, the means by which the people maintained their relationship with the powers that sustained life, with the salmon spirits who gave themselves to the people, with the corn mother who taught the art of cultivation, with the buffalo who provided everything needed for life on the plains. The oral traditions carried more than stories. They were libraries, encyclopedias, legal codes, histories, maps, all encoded in narrative and song and ceremony, a method of preserving and transmitting knowledge that did not require writing, that was in many ways more durable than written records, because it lived in people, in the practice of telling and retelling, each generation receiving the knowledge and passing it forward, altered, perhaps in small ways, adapted to new circumstances but maintaining the essential core. These traditions explained origins, where the people came from, how the world came to be. Some tribes emerged from beneath the earth, climbing up from lower worlds into this one. Others came across vast waters or descended from the sky, each story locating the people in relationship to their homeland, making the connection between tribe and territory sacred, fundamental, not a matter of possession, but of mutual belonging. The stories also carried practical information, encoded in metaphor and narrative, stories about the consequences of greed, of disrespecting the natural world, of failing to share, of breaking reciprocal relationships. These were teaching stories, ways of transmitting values and knowledge in forms that could be remembered, that worked on both children and adults, that revealed different layers of meaning depending on the understanding of the listener. Astronomical knowledge was embedded in story and ceremony. The Pleiades appeared in the narratives of tribes across the continent, marking seasons, guiding agricultural practices. Many tribes had names for this cluster, stories explaining its origin, and these stories also encoded when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. The sky was not separate from the earth, but part of the same system, the same story. The sophistication of this knowledge is only now being fully appreciated. Archaeoastronomers studying ancient sites find alignments that suggest understanding not just of the solar year, but of lunar cycles, of the precession of equinoxes, of subtle celestial mechanics that require generations of careful observation to perceive. This knowledge was not written in books, but built into the landscape, into the positioning of structures, into the timing of ceremonies, into the stories that seemed simple on the surface, but contained depths of meaning. And what of beauty? What of art, created not for museums, but for life, for ceremony, for the daily activities that filled the days? Pottery painted with designs that pleased the eye and also carried meaning, baskets woven so tightly they could hold water, each one a masterwork of patience and skill, clothing decorated with porcupine quills, and later with trade prayer beads, each pattern significant, each color chosen with intention. The creation of objects was itself ceremony, the gathering of clay, the asking permission of the earth, the preparation of materials with prayers and proper protocol, the work done with attention, with focus, imbuing the object with something beyond mere function, making it beautiful because beauty mattered, because the object would be used, would be part of life, and life deserved beauty. Music and dance expressed what words could not. Drums that echoed the heartbeat, rattles made from gourds and rawhide filled with seeds or pebbles, flutes carved from wood or bone, voices raised in song, harmonies that rose into the night sky, dances that told stories, that brought the people together in shared movement, shared rhythm, shared purpose. The circle appeared again and again in the shapes of dwellings, in the arrangement of camps, in the form of ceremonies, the circle with no beginning and no end, everyone equal in their position, able to see everyone else, the circle of the seasons, the circle of life, birth and birth again, the circle of the horizon, the great hoop of the world, everything connected, everything returning, everything part of the endless round. And now, as this journey through time and space and memory begins to draw toward its close, there is a sense of something vast having been glimpsed, incompletely, imperfectly, but glimpsed nonetheless. The long story of human presence on this continent, the story of hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own languages, their own ways of understanding, their own contributions to the great tapestry of human culture. The earthworks still stand, many of them grass-covered mounds rising from Ohio fields, geometric shapes visible from the air, testifying to the vision and labor of peoples whose names are mostly lost, but whose works remain, patient, enduring, waiting for those who will take the time to see them, to wonder about them, to recognize them for what they are. Monuments as significant as any produced by any civilization anywhere. The cliff dwellings still nestle into canyon walls, empty now of daily life, but not empty of meaning. Their careful construction, their positioning, their very existence speaks of human ingenuity, of adaptation, of the drive to create home, even in difficult places, to build communities, to endure. The stories continue, passed down through the descendants of those ancient peoples, tribes that survived despite everything, despite disease and displacement and deliberate destruction, that maintained their languages against enormous pressure, that kept their ceremonies alive, that continued the traditions, adapted them when necessary, but kept the essential core intact. This is not a story that ended, but rather one that continues. The indigenous peoples of North America are not relics of the past, not exhibits in a museum, but living cultures. Contemporary peoples who carry forward traditions that stretch back thousands of years, while also fully inhabiting the present, navigating between worlds, maintaining connection to ancestral knowledge, while engaging with modern reality. The land remembers, even when human memory fails. The land holds the traces, the patterns in the soil where ancient fields once lay, the trade routes that became trails that became roads, the place names that carry forward indigenous words, sometimes barely recognizable, sometimes perfectly preserved. The land itself a text written over millennia, layered, complex, waiting to be read by those who know how to look. There is something profound in recognizing the depth of history on this continent, in understanding that the story of North America does not begin a few hundred years ago, but stretches back into a past measured in millennia, that the peoples who were here developed civilizations, created art and architecture, governed themselves with sophistication, engaged in trade and diplomacy and warfare, experienced the full range of human endeavor and achievement. In the quiet moments, when the modern world pulls back, when the constant noise recedes, it becomes possible to sense the presence of all those who came before, all those generations who walked this land, who knew its moods and seasons, who learned its secrets and passed them forward, who created beauty and meaning, who loved and grieved and hoped, who were fully, completely human in all the ways humans have always been. The wind still moves through the canyons, across the plains, through the forests, the same wind that has always moved, carrying with it, perhaps, the echo voices of songs, of stories told in languages that sound strange to modern ears, but speak of truths that remain constant, the importance of living in balance, of maintaining relationships, of thinking 7 generations ahead, of remembering that we are all related, all connected, all part of something larger than ourselves. And in that recognition, in that quiet acknowledgement of the long story, the deep history, there is a kind of peace, a settling, a sense of being connected to something that extends backward into the distant past and forward into an equally distant future, the great chain of human experience, of culture and tradition, of wisdom gained and passed forward, of the endless work of making meaning in a complex and often difficult world. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that guided ancient travelers, that marked the seasons for farmers and hunters, that witnessed the rise and fall of cities, the movement of peoples, the slow accumulation of knowledge and tradition. They shine still, constant in their motion, patient in their witness, watching over a land that holds so many stories, so many layers of human presence, so much history, so much meaning. And perhaps that is enough to know that the story is long and rich and continuing, that the peoples of this continent have deep roots, profound traditions, enduring wisdom, that they were here shaping the land, being shaped by it for thousands upon thousands of years before the moment we call now, and that they remain carrying forward what was entrusted to them, maintaining the connection, keeping the stories alive, ensuring that the chain does not break, that the circle continues, unending. The night deepens, stars shine, and somewhere the old stories are still being told. There is a place where dreams are built in wood and steel, where imagination becomes something you can walk through, touch, see reflected in a child's widening eyes. It begins as an idea, a whisper of possibility, the notion that wonder itself might be constructed, that joy could be engineered, that entire worlds might spring forth from nothing more than vision and determination. Picture a field, an empty stretch of land. Perhaps it sits quiet beneath a pale sky, waiting. The grass moves gently in a breeze that carries with it the faint scent of earth and possibility. There is nothing here yet, only potential, only the space where something extraordinary might one day stand. This is where it always starts, in emptiness, in the moment before creation, when the ground holds no footprints, when the air carries no laughter, when the horizon stretches unbroken and still. But someone stands here, looking out across this blank canvas, and they see something different. They see pathways winding through gardens that don't exist yet, towers rising into air that remains clear and unobstructed. They hear music that hasn't been composed, voices that haven't yet arrived, the echo of joy that exists only in imagination, the history of these places, these kingdoms of make-believe made real. begins long before the first gate ever swings open, long before the first ticket is ever sold. It begins in the space between what is and what could be, in the mind of someone who dared to believe that enchantment was something that could be shared, multiplied, given form. Centuries ago, there were simpler pleasures. Village fairs that appeared with the changing seasons, traveling entertainers who brought wonder from town to town, wooden horses carved by hand, painted in bright colors that caught the light, gardens designed for strolling, fountains where people gathered just to watch water dance in sunlight. These were the seeds, the earliest hints of what would come, small moments of escape woven into the fabric of everyday life. A merchant might set up a curious machine, something that spun or lifted or created the illusion of flight. Children would gather, eyes bright with fascination, and for a moment, just a moment, the ordinary world would fall away. In Copenhagen, in the 1800s, there was a garden, Tivoli. It opened its gates in 1843, and people walked through into something they had never quite experienced before, not merely a garden, but a designed experience. Lanterns hung from trees like captured stars. Stages presented performances that ranged from music to pantomime. There were fireworks that painted the night sky in cascading colors, and everywhere, there was the sense that this was a world apart, a pocket of enchantment carved out of the everyday. This was revolutionary. The idea that pleasure could be curated, that an entire environment could be crafted specifically to transport people beyond their daily concerns. The gardens weren't wild. They were imagined, planned, each pathway leading somewhere intentional, each view composed like a painting, and people came. They walked these paths, sat in these gardens, watched these performances, and something shifted in their understanding of what was possible. Entertainment wasn't just something that happened to you. It could be something you entered into, walked through, became part of. Across the ocean in America, other seeds were taking root. Coney Island, a stretch of shoreline that would become synonymous with spectacle and sensation by the late 1800s. It had transformed from a quiet beach into something wilder, more ambitious. There were mechanical rides powered by steam, enormous structures built purely for the thrill of experiencing them, towers you could climb, wheels that lifted you high above the ground, giving you a view of the world from an angle you'd never known before. The air there smelled of salt water and roasted peanuts, of machinery and excitement. There was a rawness to it, an exuberance. These weren't refined gardens with classical music. These were experiments in sensation, in pushing the boundaries of what the human body could experience and still call fun. But even in that chaos, that carnival energy, there was something being learned, something about how people moved through space, what drew them forward, what made them linger, what made them return. The operators of these attractions were studying human nature, learning to read desire, to anticipate wonder, and someone was watching all of this very carefully, taking notes, imagining something different, something that combined the refinement of the gardens with the excitement of the mechanical rides, something that told stories, that didn't just offer sensation, but meaning, narrative, worlds complete unto themselves. The 20th century was dawning, and with it would come a transformation. The empty fields would fill, The quiet spaces would bloom with color and sound and movement, and the places where dreams are built would begin to rise, permanent, substantial, each one a testament to the belief that wonder is not something we outgrow, but something we carry with us, waiting for the right moment, the right place to let it soar once more. The name that would change everything belonged to a man who understood stories, Walter Elias Disney. Born in 1901 in Chicago, raised in a world that was itself transforming, moving from gas lamps to electric lights, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, he grew up watching the world reinvent itself. And perhaps that taught him that reinvention was possible, that what seemed fixed could be reimagined entirely. He drew pictures, told stories through moving images, created a mouse that would become more famous than most human beings. But the canvas of film wasn't enough. He wanted something more, something that existed in 3 dimensions, something you could walk through with your own feet, touch with your own hands. In the early 1950s, he began to dream of a place. He called it Disneyland, and it would be unlike anything that had come before. Not a collection of rides scattered haphazardly, not a carnival midway with games of chance and dubious operators, but a complete environment, a story made physical, where every detail served the larger vision. He faced skepticism. The amusement industry looked at his plans and saw disaster. They knew parks. They knew what worked. Cheap thrills, mechanical rides, games with prizes. But Disney was proposing something different. He wanted to build a place that was clean, family-oriented, that told stories through its very architecture. And the industry veterans shook their heads. They had seen many things fail, and this seemed destined to join them. The money was difficult. Banks didn't understand the vision. They saw risk without precedent. No comparable model existed, but Disney had something they didn't. He had his television show, and he made a deal. A BC would help finance the park in exchange for a weekly television program, and suddenly the impossible had funding, had momentum, had a path forward. He found land in Anaheim, California. Orange groves stretched across the acreage. The trees stood in neat rows, heavy with fruit, the air thick with citrus sweetness. It was quiet land, agricultural, humble. But he stood there and saw castles, Main Street, rivers carrying boats through jungles that existed only in his imagination. The transformation began in 1954. Bulldozers arrived. The orange trees came down, their removal marking the end of one purpose and the beginning of another. The earth was moved, reshaped. Waterways were dug where no water had flowed before. Hills were constructed where the land had been flat. Reality was being bent to match the dream. And the dream was specific, extraordinarily specific. He had divided this future kingdom into lands, each one a complete environment. Main Street, USA, would evoke small-town America at the turn of the century, a nostalgic vision of a past that perhaps never quite existed but felt true nonetheless. Fantasyland would bring fairy tales to life. Adventureland would offer exotic thrills. Frontierland would capture the pioneer spirit. Tomorrowland would look toward the future with optimism and wonder. The workers who built these lands were creating something unprecedented. They weren't just construction crews. They were called Imagineers, a word that married imagination with engineering, and they had to solve problems no one had faced before. How do you make a jungle in Southern California? How do you create a castle that looks medieval but meets modern building codes? How do you hide the mundane infrastructure that keeps everything running? They developed techniques, forced perspective, made buildings seem taller than they were. The upper stories were built at smaller scales, tricking the eye, making Main Street seem more grand, more dreamlike. They planted trees that would mature quickly, creating shade and atmosphere. They designed drainage systems disguised as streams and waterfalls. Every practical necessity was hidden or transformed into part of the story. Disney himself was there constantly, walking the construction site, adjusting, refining, noticing details others might overlook. If a trash can didn't match the theming of its land, it was replaced. If a sign used the wrong typeface, it was remade. Nothing was too small to matter, because he understood that magic lived in the accumulation of details, that immersion required completeness. The opening was set for July 17th, 1955, and as that date approached, the work intensified. Crews labored through the night, painting, planting, installing. There was so much still unfinished, so much that existed only partially. Tomorrowland was particularly troubled. The future was harder to build than the past. The concrete was still wet in places. Some attractions weren't ready, but the date was fixed. Television had announced it. Thousands of people were coming. Ready or not, the gates would open. That opening day became infamous. They had printed 15,000 invitations, but counterfeit tickets flooded in. Nearly 30,000 people descended on the park, far more than the unfinished grounds could handle. The temperature soared above 100 degrees. Some drinking fountains didn't work yet. A plumber's strike had forced choices, toilets or fountains. They chose toilets. The asphalt on Main Street was so fresh it stuck to women's high heels. A gas leak forced the closure of several attractions. Fantasyland, Adventureland, and Frontierland had to choose which rides could operate. It was chaos. It was disaster. The press called it Black Sunday. But something else was happening too. People were experiencing something they had never felt before, walking into a storybook, seeing characters they had only known from film walking among them, riding boats through jungles that smelled of earth and water, watching animatronic hippos rise from the river's surface, hearing their mechanical roars. Children stood before Sleeping Beauty Castle with their mouths open, not speaking, just staring, trying to reconcile the fact that this thing from their imaginations now stood solid and real before them. Parents found themselves equally transported, discovering that the appeal wasn't just for children, that there was something profound in this act of collective make-believe, this agreement to enter a world where the rules were different, where dragons might be fought and treasure might be found. Despite the disasters of opening day, people came back. They told others. Word spread. This wasn't like other amusement parks. This was something new. Within 7 weeks, 1 million people had passed through the gates. They came from across California, across America, across the world. They waited in long lines under the hot sun, and they smiled. They bought tickets and souvenirs. They ate at themed restaurants. They returned again and again. The park evolved rapidly. Disney kept changing it, adding, refining. He famously said it would never be completed, that it would continue to grow as long as there was imagination in the world. And he meant it. New attractions appeared. The Matterhorn bobsleds in 1959, a mountain that housed a roller coaster with a basketball court, hidden at its peak for cast members on break, the submarine voyage, the monorail, each edition raising the bar, showing what was possible. Other companies watched, studied, tried to understand the formula. How had Disney succeeded where conventional wisdom said he would fail? What was the secret? They saw the cleanliness, the attention to detail, the storytelling, the training of employees, cast members who were taught they were performers, not workers, that every interaction was part of the show, but understanding intellectually and executing practically were different things. Many tried to replicate the model. They built parks with theme, with characters, with stories. Most failed. The gap between concept and execution proved vast. It wasn't enough to have a theme. You had to commit to it completely, had to maintain it, had to believe in it with every nail driven and every bush planted. Six Flags Over Texas opened in 1961. Funded by real estate developer Angus Wynne. It took a different approach, historical rather than fantastical. The park was divided into sections representing the Six Flags that had flown over Texas, Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the Confederacy, the United States, each area themed to its period, with shows and attractions matching the era. It was ambitious, well executed, and it succeeded, but it was different from Disneyland. More regional in character, more focused on thrill rides than immersive environments. It proved there was room for variation, that Disney hadn't exhausted the possibilities, just opened the door. Meanwhile, Disney was already thinking bigger. Florida. He had learned lessons from California. In Anaheim, he didn't control the land around the park. Hotels and businesses had sprung up, some cheap, some garish, breaking the illusion the moment guests left the park boundaries. In Florida, he would buy enough land to control everything, to create a complete destination, a vacation kingdom isolated from the outside world. He began secretly acquiring land in Central Florida in 1963, using dummy corporations to avoid speculation, building a property that would eventually encompass over 27,000 acres, larger than Manhattan, large enough to hold not one park, but many, hotels, golf courses, an entire resort complex, a city of imagination. But he wouldn't live to see it completed. Walt Disney died in December of 1966, lung cancer. He was 65 years old, and his dream of a Florida project was still largely unrealized. Sketches and plans, models and ambitions, but not yet real. His company faced a choice: abandon the project or push forward without him. They chose to build, to honor his vision, to prove that what he had started was larger than one man. And in doing so, they would create something that would transform Central Florida, transform the theme park industry, transform the way people thought about vacation and entertainment and the places where reality and imagination meet. The work began, the swamps were drained, the land was prepared, and slowly, impossibly, the Magic Kingdom began to rise from the Florida wetlands. Another castle, another Main Street, but bigger, more ambitious, built with all the lessons learned from Disneyland, all the improvements that time and experience had suggested. Walt Disney World opened on October 1st, 1971, and it was vast in a way that defied easy comprehension. The Magic Kingdom alone covered 100 acres, but that was just the beginning. The resort spread across property that could have held San Francisco twice over. Roads wound through carefully preserved wilderness. Lakes sparkled under the Florida sun, and at the center of it all, the park itself waited like a jewel in an enormous setting. The approach was different from California. Guests didn't simply arrive at the gates. They were transported, literally. Parking lots were located far from the park entrance, and visitors boarded either a monorail or a ferry boat, traveling across Seven Seas Lagoon, watching the park grow larger as they approached, the castle rising higher, the anticipation building with every moment. By the time they stepped onto Main Street, they had already left the ordinary world behind. This was intentional, carefully orchestrated. The transition from reality to fantasy needed space, needed time, needed physical distance, and the Florida property provided all of that. You couldn't see highways from inside the park, couldn't hear traffic. The outside world was held at bay by sheer geography, by ownership, by design. Main Street here was larger than its California counterpart, the buildings taller, the street wider, the castle at its end. Cinderella Castle soared to 189 feet, almost twice the height of Sleeping Beauty Castle in Anaheim. It dominated the skyline, visible from almost everywhere in the park, a constant reminder of where you were, what world you had entered. Inside the castle, they had created something unexpected, a restaurant, Cinderella's Royal Table, where children could dine in what felt like a medieval banquet hall. The ceiling arched overhead. Murals depicted scenes from the fairy tale. Cast members, dressed in period costume, served food. And for the duration of a meal, you inhabited the story. You were inside the narrative, looking out through windows at a kingdom spread below. But the innovations went deeper than size and spectacle. Beneath the Magic Kingdom, invisible to guests above, lay the Utilidor, a system of tunnels that allowed cast members and supplies to move through the park without breaking the illusion. A worker dressed as a cowboy from Frontierland never had to walk through Tomorrowland. They could move underground, emerging only in their proper place, their proper time, their proper story. The waste management system was revolutionary. Trash was sucked through pneumatic tubes at 60 miles per hour, whisked away to a central collection point. Guests never saw overflowing bins, never smelled garbage rotting in the Florida heat. The cleanliness that had been a hallmark in California became even more pronounced here, almost supernatural in its consistency. The attention to horticulture reached new levels. The landscape team planted palm trees and tropical flowers, creating lush gardens that looked like they had always been there, but everything was chosen. Nothing was accidental. The colors were coordinated to bloom in sequence, ensuring visual interest throughout the year. The shapes and textures were balanced, creating compositions that would have satisfied a painter's eye. They even controlled the smells. The Smellitzer, a device that could pump specific scents into areas of the park, vanilla on Main Street, salt water near the Pirates of the Caribbean, creating invisible layers of atmosphere, engaging senses that guests didn't consciously notice, but that deepened the immersion nonetheless. And people came, in numbers that exceeded even optimistic projections. 10,000 guests passed through on opening day, but within a year, the annual attendance had reached 10 million. Families saved for months, drove for days, camped in station wagons at rest stops, all to reach this place, this destination that had become synonymous with childhood dreams and family memories. The impact on Central Florida was seismic. Orlando transformed from a quiet citrus town to a tourism capital. Hotels rose from empty land. Restaurants multiplied. Highways expanded. The economy restructured itself around the mouse, around the castle, around the dream. Other companies saw the success and wanted to replicate it, but they also saw the cost. Disney had spent $400 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, building something that couldn't be easily copied. The barrier to entry had been raised enormously. Six Flags expanded, becoming a chain. Parks opened in Georgia, in Missouri, in New Jersey, each one themed differently, but following a similar model. Regional parks with themed areas and increasingly sophisticated rides. They couldn't match Disney's immersive storytelling, but they could offer thrills, roller coasters that pushed the limits of speed and height. And there was a market for that, for pure adrenaline, for the scream rather than the smile. In Ohio, Cedar Point had been operating since 1870, but in the 1970s, it began its transformation into something new, the roller coaster capital. They built the Gemini in 1978, a racing coaster that sent two trains side by side through a course of hills and turns, and they didn't stop. Every few years, a new coaster, each one breaking some record, tallest, fastest, most inversions. The park became a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, for people who wanted not immersion but intensity. The industry was diversifying, finding niches. Disney owned the family market, the detailed theming, the gentle magic, but others could compete on different terms, on thrills, on regional appeal, on price points that made them accessible to different demographics. In 1982, Disney opened Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Walt's vision of a functional city had been transformed into a theme park, but an unusual one, the front half. Future World featured massive pavilions sponsored by corporations. Exxon sponsored the universe of energy. General Motors sponsored the world of motion. Each pavilion was part attraction, part educational experience, part corporate showcase. The icon was Spaceship Earth, a massive geodesic sphere 180 feet in diameter. Inside, a slow-moving dark ride took guests through the history of human communication. From cave paintings to computer networks, the narration was serious, educational, voiced by Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, lending gravitas to what could have been a simple ride. The back half of Epcot, World Showcase, featured 11 pavilions representing different countries: Mexico, Norway, China, Germany, Italy, America, Japan, Morocco, France, United Kingdom, Canada, each one staffed by citizens of that nation, serving authentic food, selling native crafts, presenting cultural performances. It was theme park as permanent World's Fair, education disguised as entertainment, or perhaps entertainment elevated by education. Critics were mixed. Some found it corporate, sterile, too educational for children, not exciting enough for adults, but it drew crowds. Millions came to ride the rides, taste the foods, marvel at the ambition, and over time it would be refined, adjusted, made more entertaining, more Disney, but never quite losing that original educational impulse. Disney was proving that theme parks could be more than escapism. They could be battered vehicles for ideas, for cultural exchange, for optimistic visions of the future. And while not every experiment succeeded, the willingness to experiment itself was important. It kept the medium alive, evolving, searching for what else it could be. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another transformation was beginning. Tokyo Disneyland opened in April of 1983, the first Disney park built outside the United States. It was licensed, not owned by Disney, but built to exacting standards, overseen by Imagineers who ensured that every detail matched the quality guests expected. The Japanese embraced it with an enthusiasm that surprised even Disney. Attendance numbers soared. The park became a cultural phenomenon. Families visited multiple times a year. Young women in particular adopted the parks as a fashion destination, coordinating outfits, collecting merchandise, creating a subculture around Disney that was uniquely Japanese in its intensity and dedication. This international success opened new possibilities. If the model worked in Japan, where else might it succeed? Europe, China. The dream was becoming global, spreading across continents, adapting to different cultures while maintaining core identity. Back in America, Universal Studios was watching Disney's success with keen interest. They had theme park experience. The Universal Studios Hollywood tour had been operating since 1964, taking visitors behind the scenes of a working film studio, showing them sets and special effects. But they wanted more. They wanted a destination resort that could compete directly with Disney. They chose Orlando, building practically in Disney's backyard. Universal Studios Florida opened in June of 1990, and it brought a different sensibility. Where Disney emphasized whimsy and fantasy, Universal leaned into movies, into thrills, into darker themes. Jaws, King Kong, Earthquake. These weren't gentle stories. They were visceral, frightening, exhilarating. The execution was troubled. Many attractions weren't ready on opening day. The Jaws ride in particular suffered constant mechanical failures, breaking down multiple times daily, but Universal persisted, fixing problems, improving systems, and gradually the park found its footing, found its audience, people who wanted something edgier than Disney, something that felt more grown up, more cinematic. The competition pushed both companies to innovate. Disney responded by opening Disney MGM Studios in 1989, their own movie-themed park, featuring attractions based on Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Twilight Zone. They were fighting for the same audience now, the same tourist dollars, and the guests benefited because competition drove creativity, drove investment, drove both companies to keep building, keep improving, keep imagining new ways to astonish. The 1990s saw an explosion of themed entertainment. New parks opened across America, across the world, each one trying to find its unique angle, its reason to exist in an increasingly crowded market. Some succeeded, many failed. The landscape was littered with ambitious projects that couldn't sustain themselves, couldn't compete with the established giants who had perfected the formulas, who had the intellectual property, the budgets, the expertise. But the successful ones, they were magnificent. They pushed boundaries, combined technology with storytelling in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined, dark rides incorporated projection mapping. Animatronics became so sophisticated they seemed truly alive. Roller coasters launched magnetically, reaching speeds that earlier engineers would have thought impossible. Inversions and elements that defied gravity, that made riders scream with equal parts terror and joy. The turn of the millennium brought new ambitions, new technologies, and new understandings of what a theme park could be. Islands of Adventure opened in Orlando in 1999, Universal's second gate, and it represented a leap forward in immersive design. The park was built around a central lagoon with 5 islands, each one a complete world unto itself. Marvel's Superhero Island, Toon Lagoon, Jurassic Park, The Lost Continent, Seuss Landing. Walking from one island to another meant crossing a threshold, not just physically but atmospherically. The music changed, the architecture transformed, even the vegetation shifted to match the theme. Tropical plants in Jurassic Park, whimsical twisted trees in Seuss Landing, and the commitment to theming went deeper than Disney had typically ventured. These weren't sanitized versions of their source material. They were full-throated embracements, comic book heroes at actual scale, dinosaurs that roared with genuine menace. The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man opened as the park's flagship attraction, and it changed what people thought dark rides could be. It combined moving vehicles with 3-dimensional sets and screens, projecting computer-generated imagery that seemed to surround riders. Villains appeared to leap from buildings. Fireballs seemed to rush toward you. The vehicle tilted and spun in sync with the action, creating an illusion of movement through space that was breathtaking in its completeness. Guests emerged from that ride blinking, trying to reconcile what they had just experienced. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a ride. It was something between something new, and it set a standard that would influence attraction design for decades to come. But perhaps the most significant development of this era was still gestating, waiting to transform everything once again. Harry Potter. The books had become a global phenomenon, and film rights had been secured. The movies were breaking box office records, and theme park executives looked at this property and saw possibility, saw potential beyond anything that had come before. Disney had been offered the rights first, but they had passed. Their vision for what a Harry Potter area might be didn't align with what the author, J.K. Rowling, demanded. She wanted complete authenticity, absolute fidelity to her vision. She wanted butterbeer to taste exactly as she imagined it, wanted Hogwarts to be built to proper scale, wanted everything, every detail, to match what readers had fallen in love with. Universal said yes to those demands and began work on what would become the wizarding world of Harry Potter. It opened in Islands of Adventure in June of 2010, and the impact was immediate, seismic, transformative. They had recreated Hogsmeade, the village from the books, with such precision that walking through it felt like stepping into the pages. The shops sold actual merchandise from the wizarding world. Honeydukes offered sweets described in the books. Ollivanders sold wands, interactive wands, that could trigger effects throughout the land if you knew the proper movements, the proper spells. Hogwarts Castle loomed over everything, built at full scale, its towers and turrets reaching into the Florida sky, and inside, the ride, Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, combined robotic arms with projection domes and physical sets in a way that had never been attempted. Riders soared over Hogwarts, encountered Dementors, played Quidditch, all while their bench moved in impossible ways, tilting, rotating, creating sensations of flight that felt genuinely magical. The cultural impact was unprecedented. Attendance at Universal's parks surged. Wait times for the Harry Potter attractions stretched to hours. Guests arrived before dawn, hoping to be among the first to enter, to experience this world they had loved in books and film, now made tangible, made real. Disney noticed, everyone noticed, this wasn't just a successful attraction. It was a new paradigm, proof that if you committed completely to a property, if you honored it rather than simply exploited it, if you gave fans not an approximation but the real thing, they would come in numbers that justified any expense, any effort. The arms race intensified. Disney acquired Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, amassing intellectual property that could be transformed into themed lands. Universal deepened its partnership with Nintendo, Comcast, with resources to match Disney, fought for every advantage, every edge. Technology advanced rapidly. Projection systems improved, becoming brighter, more realistic, able to create images that fooled the eye even in daylight. Animatronics incorporated more subtle movements, micro-expressions, breathing, blinking. The uncanny valley was being crossed. Figures that seemed genuinely alive rather than mechanical approximations. Star Wars: Galaxy's Edge opened at Disneyland in May of 2019 and at Disney's Hollywood Studios in August of the same year. It was Disney's answer to Harry Potter, a 14-acre land that recreated the planet Batu, an outpost world on the edge of known space. Every cast member stayed in character. Every interaction was an opportunity for storytelling. The land was set during a specific time in the Star Wars timeline between episodes 8 and 9, and guests were meant to feel like they were living through events, not just observing them. The centerpiece attraction, Star Wars: Rise of the Resistance, was staggering in its ambition. Guests were recruited by the Resistance, captured by the First Order, taken aboard a Star Destroyer. The experience involved multiple ride systems, trackless vehicles, motion simulators, physical sets the size of warehouses, animatronics, projections, practical effects. It lasted nearly 20 minutes, and it told a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. The cost was rumored to exceed $1 billion for the land, but Disney had learned the lesson Universal taught with Harry Potter. If you build it right, if you commit completely, they will come, and they will keep coming year after year, bringing their children, their grandchildren, making it part of their family tradition. But something else was happening too, a shift in how these places were understood. They were no longer just amusement parks. They had become cultural institutions, pilgrimage sites, places people felt compelled to visit, not once but repeatedly, building traditions around annual trips, seasonal celebrations, special events. Disney created special ticketed events, Mickey's Not-So-Scary Halloween Party, Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party, times when the parks closed early to regular guests and reopened for those who had purchased event tickets, offering special shows, unique character interactions, exclusive merchandise, and people paid premium prices. not because they had to, but because these events became part of their family's yearly rhythm, markers of time's passage, anchors of memory. The parks had also become increasingly sophisticated in their data collection, their understanding of guest behavior. Magic bands at Disney World tracked every interaction, every purchase, every ride, creating detailed profiles that allowed for personalization, but also for optimization. They knew crowd patterns, could predict demand, adjust staffing, modify wait times. The parks were becoming smart, responsive, adaptive systems that could tune themselves in real time. European expansion brought new challenges. Disneyland Paris opened in April of 1992, and it struggled initially. European vacation patterns were different. Cultural attitudes toward American entertainment were complex. The weather was colder, rainier than Florida or California. Attendance lagged projections. The company lost money for years, but they persisted, refined the offering, added attractions, and gradually it found its audience, became profitable, became beloved. Shanghai Disneyland opened in June of 2016, Disney's first park in mainland China. It was built in partnership with the Chinese government, designed specifically for Chinese guests. Attractions featured Chinese language and cultural elements. The castle was the tallest Disney had ever built. The park incorporated feng shui principles in its design, and it succeeded, drawing millions of visitors, proving that the model could adapt, could respect local culture while maintaining its essential identity. But perhaps the most significant development of recent years came not from expansion, but from interruption. In March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic forced theme parks worldwide to close. Disney World, Disneyland, Universal, parks across the globe went dark, silent, empty for the first time since they had opened. The images were haunting: Main Street with no crowds, castles reflected in puddles with no one to see them, roller coasters still against empty skies. These places that had been built to hold tens of thousands stood vacant, waiting, and the world felt the absence, felt the loss more keenly than anyone might have predicted. When they reopened, months later, it was different. Capacity was limited, masks were required, social distancing markers appeared on queues, character interactions happened from a distance. The spontaneous moments of connection were mediated by precaution, and yet people came, grateful just to be back, to reclaim something that felt normal, that felt joyful in a time of considerable darkness. The pandemic had revealed something important. These places weren't frivolous, weren't merely commercial enterprises. They served a function in people's lives, psychological, emotional. They were places where memories were made deliberately, where families came together with shared purpose, where the ordinary strictures of life were temporarily suspended in favor of wonder, of play, of imagination made manifest. As the parks fully reopened, as capacity restrictions lifted, as masks came off and characters could once again embrace children, there was a sense of restoration, of something important being returned. The attendance numbers rebounded quickly, surpassing pre-pandemic levels, proving that the appetite for these experiences hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown, sharpened by absence into something closer to need. And now, in this current moment, the parks continue to evolve. Virtual queues replace physical lines at popular attractions. Mobile apps handle reservations and purchases. Augmented reality overlays digital elements onto physical spaces, creating hybrid experiences that blur the boundaries even further. Technology serves the story, serves the immersion, finding new ways to astonish, new methods of transport. The question that hangs in the air now, suspended like a thought half-formed, is what comes next. Where does this evolution lead? When everything that can be imagined can seemingly be built, when budgets reach into the billions, when technology can create any illusion, any sensation, what new threshold remains to be crossed? What new dream remains to be constructed in steel and stone and light? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what can be built next, but in what these places have always been building, beneath the attractions and the spectacle, beneath the merchandise and the carefully engineered emotions. They have been constructing something more subtle, more enduring, a shared language of memory, a vocabulary of wonder that spans generations. Consider the grandmother who takes her granddaughter to the same park she visited as a child. They walk down the same street, though it has been refreshed, maintained, subtly updated. The experience creates a bridge across time. The grandmother remembers herself young, her own wonder reflected now in the child's face, and the child, years from now, will bring her own daughter, her own granddaughter, creating a chain of memory that links past to future through the simple act of walking through a gate into a designed world. This is architecture of a peculiar kind. Buildings constructed not just in space but in time, designed to persist, to accumulate meaning with each visit, each generation. The park becomes a constant in an inconstant world, while everything else changes, careers shift, relationships evolve, technology transforms daily life beyond recognition. These places remain familiar, reliable, offering the same music, the same stories, the same comfort of predictable magic. The psychology is fascinating. Adults who visit these parks often report feeling something they describe as nostalgia, but it's more complex than simple longing for the past. It's a reconnection with a version of themselves that still exists, dormant beneath the responsibilities and disappointments of adulthood, the part that believed in magic, in possibility, in happy endings. Stepping through those gates gives permission to access that self again, temporarily, safely. And the parks know this. The Imagineers who design them understand they're not just creating entertainment, they're creating vessels for emotion, containers for memory. Every detail is calibrated to evoke, to suggest, to remind. The scent of vanilla on Main Street recalls childhood treats. The sound of a particular musical theme triggers associations built over decades of films and visits. The sight of a castle against the sunset activates something primal, something that responds to beauty and scale and the suggestion of stories. There is craft here that goes unnoticed. The way pathways narrow and widen to control crowd flow while creating moments of compression and release. The way forced perspective makes buildings seem taller, distances seem greater, creating a sense of epic scale within limited acreage. The way color is used, saturated hues in fantasy areas, muted tones in historical sections, each choice supporting the psychological impact of the environment. The seasonal transformations add another layer. Halloween brings pumpkins and fall colors. harvest themes that tap into ancient associations with that time of year. Christmas brings lights, thousands upon thousands of lights, transforming the parks into something even more fantastical. Winter wonderlands in places where winter never comes. The decorations change, but the underlying structure remains, teaching visitors that change and constancy can coexist. That transformation is possible within continuity. But there are shadows in this picture too, questions that deserve consideration. These places are expensive, increasingly so. A family vacation that once seemed accessible now requires significant planning, saving, sacrifice. There is a democratic ideal in amusement, the notion that joy should be available to all. But the reality is more complicated. Admission prices climb, hotel rates soar. The experience becomes stratified. Those who can afford extra services, skip-the-line passes, concierge experiences, have a fundamentally different visit than those who cannot. The labor practices warrant examination. The cast members who create the magic often struggle to afford living near the parks where they work. They commute long distances, work multiple jobs. The smile they offer is genuine, trained, professional, but behind it may be genuine stress, genuine struggle. The disconnect between the luxury product they help create and their own economic reality creates a tension that occasionally surfaces in labor disputes, in organizing efforts, in quiet resentments. The environmental impact, too. The massive amounts of energy required to run these operations, the water consumed in fountains and attractions, and landscaping in places where water is increasingly precious, the waste generated by millions of visitors, the carbon footprint of travel as families fly from across continents. These are not small concerns, and while companies invest in solar arrays, in sustainability initiatives, in recycling programs, the fundamental model built on mass consumption and constant growth presents challenges that technology alone may not solve. And yet, there is something that persists, something that resists easy cynicism. Watch a child meet their favorite character for the first time. See the recognition, the disbelief, the joy that overwhelms them. That's real. Watch a parent cry watching their child experience something they remember from their own childhood. That emotion is authentic, hard-earned, meaningful. These places deal in the currency of happiness. And while happiness can be manufactured, commodified, sold, it remains valuable, remains necessary. Humans need places set apart from ordinary life, need permission to play, to imagine, to believe, even temporarily, in magic, in goodness, in the triumph of heroes, and the possibility of happy endings. The parks serve as modern temples in a sense, secular sacred spaces where people come to perform rituals, to mark occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, the first visit, the 100th visit, each one a marker, a way of saying this moment matters, this experience is worth preserving, worth traveling for, worth the expense and the crowds and the Florida heat, and perhaps that's the deepest magic these places perform. Not the animatronics or the projection mapping or the perfectly timed fireworks, but the permission they grant, the social agreement they facilitate, that for the duration of your visit, you can believe, you can wonder, you can let go of irony and sophistication and simply feel, simply enjoy, simply be present in a moment designed entirely for your delight. The sun sets over the parks, as it has every evening since they opened, the sky painted in colors that seem brighter here, more saturated, whether that's an atmospheric effect or simply attention, simply the willingness to look up and notice. The lights come on, one by one, transforming the environments again. The daytime parks are beautiful, bright, inviting, but the nighttime parks are enchanted, mysterious, lit by warm glows that suggest lanterns from centuries past, by colored floods that paint castles in jewel tones, by tiny white lights strung through trees like captured stars. Music drifts from speakers hidden in foliage, in facades, creating soundscapes that shift as you walk. Adventure gives way to fantasy, gives way to tomorrow. Each transition smooth, almost subliminal. You don't notice the moment it changes, only that the atmosphere has shifted, adapted, guided you deeper into whatever story this particular land is telling. The crowds thin as closing time approaches. Families gather for one last attraction, one last treat. Children fight sleep, wanting to stay to see just one more thing. Parents negotiate, promise returns, future visits. The gates that opened this morning will close tonight, and tomorrow they will open again. The same but different, because different people will walk through, bringing their own expectations, their own dreams, their own capacity for wonder. Somewhere in the parks, a cast member is making magic for the last guests of the evening, staying in character though they're tired, though their feet hurt, though they've answered the same questions 100 times today. They smile. They engage because they understand their role, understand that for this family, this might be the only visit, the only chance, and every interaction matters, carries weight, becomes part of someone's story. The maintenance crews will arrive soon, after the guests have left. They'll walk the paths with different eyes, looking for trash that needs collecting, light bulbs that need replacing, paint that needs touching up. They'll work through the night, these invisible custodians, ensuring that tomorrow's guests find everything perfect, find no evidence of wear, of use, of the thousands who walked these same paths today. This cycle has repeated for decades now, will repeat for decades to come. Each day a fresh beginning, each night a gentle ending. The parks exist in a kind of eternal present, always today, never yesterday, never tomorrow, just this moment, this visit, this experience unfolding in real time. And perhaps that's the final gift these places offer, presence in a world increasingly characterized by distraction, by fractured attention, by the constant pull of devices and notifications and demands. The parks create environments where presence is almost mandatory, where you must be here, now, physically moving through space, experiencing things that cannot be replicated on a screen, cannot be reduced to data, cannot be consumed any way other than being there, walking, looking, feeling. The castle stands against the darkening sky, solid, permanent. Though it was built to look like stone, it's steel and concrete, fiber-reinforced gypsum, modern materials pretending to be ancient, but the pretense is beautiful, meaningful. It suggests that dreams can be solid, that imagination can be structured, that the impossible can be built and touched and photographed and remembered. Fireworks begin, the evening show, explosions of light and color painting the sky, reflecting in water, in windows, in upturned faces, and for these minutes Everyone stops. Everyone looks up, sharing this moment. Strangers united in collective wonder, in appreciation of the beauty created solely for this purpose, to be beautiful, to inspire awe, to make people gasp and smile and reach for loved ones' hands. The show ends. The crowd applauds, begins to disperse, moving slowly toward exits, tired but happy, carrying bags full of souvenirs, heads full of memories, cameras full of images that will never quite capture what it felt like to be here, to experience this, to live inside the dream for a day. The park's empty. Grow quiet. The music softens, becomes background, becomes silence. The lights remain, keeping watch, waiting. Tomorrow they will fill again, with different faces, different stories, different dreams, but the same essential hope, the same desire for magic, for escape, for transformation, for the chance to step outside ordinary life and into something extraordinary, something built, something imagined, something real, and in the stillness, in the spaces between one day and the next, the parks rest, dreaming perhaps of all the dreams they've housed, all the joy they've witnessed, all the memories they've helped create, standing ready, always ready, to open their gates again, to welcome seekers of wonder, builders of memories, believers in magic, back into the worlds where imagination takes form, where stories become places, where dreams, for a little while, come true. There is a world that exists just beyond the edge of what we think we know, a world that has been unfolding quietly for hundreds of millions of years, long before we arrived to give it names, long before we learned to look closely enough to see. It is a world of green things, of cells and chlorophyll, of roots reaching downward into darkness and leaves lifting upward toward light. A world that covers the surface of this planet in patterns so intricate and so vast that they shape the very air we breathe. Tonight, I find myself thinking about this world, about the silent architectures of plants, about the way a single seed contains within itself an entire future, waiting. The science of this world has a name, Botany, from the ancient Greek word for grass or fodder. But the word feels too small for what it holds, too neat and contained for something that encompasses forests and ferns, mosses and mangroves, the towering redwoods and the smallest algae drifting in a drop of pond water. I imagine standing at the threshold of a greenhouse just after dusk, when the glass panels have fogged slightly with the moisture of 1,000 breathing leaves, when the light outside has faded to a deep indigo and the shapes inside become soft and dreamlike, half seen. The air would be thick, almost tangible, carrying the mineral scent of wet soil and the green perfume of living tissue, that particular smell that rises from stems when they're cut, from roots when they're lifted from the earth, a smell that is somehow ancient and immediate at once, in this threshold space, neither fully inside nor out. I think about what it means to study the lives of organisms that cannot move away, cannot speak, cannot do anything but grow and adapt and quietly persist, transforming sunlight into sugar, pulling nutrients from stone, breathing out oxygen in an exchange so fundamental that it makes all other life possible. The earliest humans who paid attention to plants were not called botanists. They were called survivors. They learned which roots would sustain them through winter, which leaves would heal a wound, which seeds could be stored and planted when the seasons turned. They learned by trial and error, by watching what the animals ate, by tasting and waiting to see what happened next. But there came a time when observation became something more, when people began to ask not just which plants were useful, but how they worked, why one plant grew in shade while another demanded sun, why some bloomed in spring and others waited until autumn, why a cutting from one plant could grow into an entirely new individual, identical to its parent. These questions opened doorways, and beyond those doorways lay gardens of knowledge that branched and branched again, leading in 1,000 directions toward taxonomy and physiology, toward ecology and genetics, toward understandings that would reshape how we see not just plants, but life itself. I think of the first person who looked at a flower and wondered about its purpose, who saw that the bright petals and the visiting insects were connected, that the dust on a bee's legs carried something essential from one blossom to another, that what looked like beauty was also function, strategy, survival coded into color and scent. I think of the first person who sliced a stem thin enough to see through, who placed it under a lens and discovered that what seemed solid was actually chambered, cellular, made of tiny rooms with walls and doors, conducting water upward, moving sugars downward, a hidden infrastructure as complex as any human city. And I think of how these discoveries built upon one another, slowly, over centuries, each generation handing the next a slightly clearer picture, a slightly deeper question. The greenhouse, I imagine, stands quiet now in the gathering dark, its inhabitants continuing their slow work of photosynthesis, of growth, of responding to signals we are only beginning to understand, signals carried in wavelengths of light, in chemical messengers that travel from root to shoot, in the subtle pull of gravity that tells a seed which way is up. In this moment between day and night, in this space where the human world pauses, the plant world continues its ancient rhythms, unfurling leaves that will capture tomorrow's light, extending roots that will find tomorrow's water, preparing flowers that will open according to schedules written into their very cells. And somewhere in the long history of botany, there are stories waiting, stories of people who devoted themselves to understanding this green world, who traveled to remote places seeking specimens, who filled notebooks with careful drawings, who asked questions that seemed simple but led to revelations, who built the foundations of a science that would eventually touch everything from medicine to agriculture, from ecology to evolution. These stories begin, as so many stories do, with curiosity, with someone who looked at a leaf and saw not just green, but mystery. The earliest attempts to understand plants were not written down. They lived in memory and practice, passed from one generation to the next in the knowledge of which bark would ease a fever, which berries would nourish, which roots could be ground into flour when other food grew scarce. But around 2,300 years ago, in the Mediterranean world, something began to shift. People started writing down what they observed, started trying to organize the bewildering diversity of plant life into categories that the mind could hold. There was a man named Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle's, who walked through the gardens and wild places of ancient Greece, noting the differences between trees and shrubs and herbs, observing how some plants had flowers and others did not, how some grew from seeds and others seemed to spring from the earth fully formed. He wrote 2 works that would survive the centuries: Enquiry into Plants and on the Causes of Plants. And in these texts, he tried to make sense of what he saw, grouping plants by their forms, by whether they were wild or cultivated, by the textures of their leaves and the patterns of their growth. Theophrastus noticed that some plants had hearts of wood, solid cores that made them strong and tall, while others remained soft and green throughout. He saw that certain plants needed moisture while others thrived in dry soil, that some bore flowers that became fruit while others produced only leaves. His observations were careful, detailed, but he worked without a lens, without the ability to see the hidden structures that would later explain so much. He could only describe what was visible to the naked eye, and try to find patterns in the overwhelming variety. For more than 1,000 years, his work remained the foundation. Other scholars added to it, corrected it, expanded it, but the fundamental approach stayed the same: observation and classification, the slow accumulation of facts about which plants existed and where they grew. In the 1st century were a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides traveled with the Roman armies, and everywhere he went, he collected information about plants, particularly those with medicinal properties. He compiled this knowledge into a work called De Materia Medica, describing nearly 600 plants and their uses. This text became essential, copied and recopied through the medieval period, translated into Arabic and Latin and Persian, its pages illustrated with drawings that became more and more stylized with each reproduction, until sometimes the plants were barely recognizable, transformed into decorative symbols of themselves. Medieval monks grew plants in their monastery gardens, carefully tending herbs for healing and vegetables for sustenance. They copied ancient texts and sometimes added their own observations, but much of their work focused on the practical, on cultivation and use, rather than on understanding the fundamental nature of plant life. The plants themselves were seen as fixed, unchanging, each species a separate creation, perfect and complete. The idea that they might be related to one another, that they might share common ancestors or respond to their environments by changing over generations, these ideas had not yet taken root. But then came the age of exploration, and suddenly the known world expanded. Ships returned from distant lands carrying specimens that no European had ever seen. Plants with strange leaves and unfamiliar flowers, fruits of bizarre shapes and colors, woods with unexpected properties. Each voyage brought new questions, new categories that needed to be created, new mysteries to solve. In the 1500s, herbals began to appear, books dedicated entirely to describing and illustrating plants. Otto Brunfels published his Living Portraits of Plants with detailed woodcuts that showed what the plants actually looked like, not stylized symbols but careful representations. Leon Hartfuchs followed with his own herbal, even more precisely illustrated, showing roots and stems and flowers with scientific accuracy. These books were expensive, laborious to produce, but they represented something new, a commitment to seeing plants as they truly were, to recording their forms with fidelity. And there was a doctor in Italy named Andrea Cesalpino who looked at the work of classification and felt that it needed a new foundation. He proposed that plants should be grouped not just by obvious similarities, but by their fruits and seeds, by their reproductive structures. This was a radical idea, that the key to understanding plants lay in how they perpetuated themselves. The 1600s brought new tools. The microscope allowed scholars to see what had always been invisible. Robert Hooke in England examined a thin slice of cork and saw that it was made of tiny chambers. He called them cells, little rooms, though what he was seeing were actually the empty walls left behind after the living cells had died. Marcello Malpighi in Italy looked at living plant tissue under his lenses and saw structures within structures, vessels that carried fluids, tissues that performed different functions. The plant body revealed itself as far more complex than anyone had imagined. Not a simple green substance, but an architecture, an organization of specialized parts. Nehemiah Grew published The Anatomy of Plants, describing the internal structures he observed, the way wood was laid down in annual rings, the way sap moved through vessels, the differences between the anatomy of stems and roots and leaves. Each page added detail to the emerging picture of how plants were constructed. But even as these investigators peered deeper into the plant body, the larger question of how to organize the diversity of plant life remained unsolved. There were thousands of known species now, tens of thousands, and more arriving with every ship. How could they be arranged in a way that made sense, that revealed something true about their nature? John Ray in England worked for decades on this problem. He introduced the concept of species as the fundamental unit. A species was a group of plants that bred true, that produced offspring like themselves. This was a practical definition, one that could be tested and observed. Ray also saw that species could be grouped into larger categories, genera based on shared characteristics. He published catalogs attempting to organize all known plants, but the system was complex, hard to use, full of exceptions and special cases. Then in the 1700s, a Swedish naturalist named Carl Linnaeus approached the problem with fresh eyes and unshakable confidence. Linnaeus believed that nature had an order, a divine order, and that it was possible for the human mind to discover and describe it. He set out to name every living thing, to give each a place in a grand hierarchy that would make the relationships between organisms clear. His insight was to use a simple binomial system, 2 names for each species, the first indicating the genus, the broader group, the second indicating the specific type within that genus, Rosa canina, Rosa rugosa. Each species of rose with its own epithet, but all clearly grouped together. The system was elegant, memorable, practical. It could be learned and applied by anyone who studied plants, and Linnaeus applied it with remarkable thoroughness, publishing his Species Plantarum in 1753, a work that attempted to name and classify every plant known to European science. He based his classification primarily on the reproductive parts of plants, counting stamens and pistils, using these numbers to create groups and subdivisions. It was an artificial system in many ways. It grouped together plants that were not truly related, but it worked. It gave botanists a common language, a shared framework, and the binomial names he created stuck, became standard, are still used today, even though the classification system built around them has been revised and revised again as understanding deepened. Linnaeus worked from specimens, dried plants pressed flat and mounted on paper, sent to him from correspondents around the world. He had students who traveled on expeditions seeking new species, new additions to the catalog, and many of them died in the pursuit of fever, of a shipwreck, of the countless dangers that came with traveling to remote and unfamiliar places. But the specimens kept arriving, and the herbaria grew. Vast libraries of pressed plants, reference collections that allowed comparison and study. You could hold in your hand a leaf collected 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and compare it with a fresh specimen, seeing what stayed constant and what varied. The 18th century also brought new questions about how plants actually lived, how they grew and functioned. Stephen Hales conducted experiments on the movement of water through plants, measuring the force with which sap rose, demonstrating that leaves gave off moisture to the air, that plants were not passive objects but dynamic systems, constantly taking in and releasing substances. Joseph Priestley discovered that plants affected the air around them, that a plant in a sealed container could restore air that a candle had exhausted. He didn't fully understand what was happening, didn't yet know about oxygen and carbon dioxide, but he had glimpsed the great exchange, the way plants transform the atmosphere. Jan Ingenhousz built on this work, showing that plants needed light to purify air, that in darkness they did the opposite. He was approaching the truth of photosynthesis, though the full mechanism would take many more decades to unravel. These investigators were learning that plants were not simple, not easily reduced to description and classification. They were chemical factories, performing transformations that seemed almost miraculous, taking in water and air and light, and from these immaterial things, building solid matter, wood and leaf and root, substance from sunlight. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Each discovery opened new territories of ignorance, revealed how much remained unknown. And so the 19th century arrived, bringing with it new tools, new ideas, new ways of seeing that would transform botany from a practice of collecting and naming into something deeper, something that sought to understand not just what plants were, but how they came to be. The world was being mapped, explored, catalogued with an intensity that had never existed before. Botanical gardens flourished in European capitals. Glass houses rose like crystal palaces, their curved panes holding climates from distant lands, tropical heat in London, desert dryness in Paris, allowing plants from every corner of the earth to be studied side by side. Expeditions set out with botanists aboard, men who would spend years in remote regions, collecting specimens, making drawings, pressing plants between sheets of paper, sometimes tens of thousands of specimens from a single journey, each one carefully labeled with the location where it was found, the date, the conditions in which it grew. Alexander von Humboldt traveled through South America, climbing mountains and traversing jungles, and as he went he noticed patterns. He saw that plants changed with elevation, that climbing a mountain in the tropics was like traveling from the equator to the poles, each 1,000 feet of altitude bringing a new community of plants, adapted to cooler temperatures, thinner air. He understood that plants didn't exist in isolation. They were shaped by their environments, by temperature and rainfall and soil, and the presence of other organisms. He began to see ecology, though the word didn't exist yet, the web of relationships that connected living things to each other and to the physical world, Robert Brown in England was looking through his microscopes at pollen grains, watching them jiggle and dance in water, a random motion that would later bear his name. But more importantly, he was looking at the internal structure of cells, and he saw within them a darker spot, a nucleus, a center that seemed to be present in all living cells. Matthias Schleiden looked at plant tissues and proposed that all plants were made of cells, that the cell was the fundamental unit of plant life. And Theodor Schwann extended this idea to animals. Together they formulated cell theory, the recognition that all living things were cellular, that life was built from these microscopic chambers, each one a small world unto itself. The implications were staggering. It meant that a towering oak and a tiny moss were built on the same principles, that life had a unity, a common architecture, regardless of how different organisms might appear on the surface. Meanwhile, the mystery of how plants reproduced was finally being solved. For centuries it had been unclear whether plants had sexes, whether they truly had male and female parts, or whether seeds simply formed spontaneously. But careful observation and experimentation revealed the truth. The stamens produced pollen, the pistils received it, and without the transfer of pollen from one to the other, most plants would produce no seeds. The bright petals, the sweet nectar, the intricate shapes of flowers, all of it served the purpose of facilitating this transfer, attracting insects and birds, or catching the wind, ensuring that pollen reached its destination. Christian Conrad Sprengel documented how flowers and insects were matched to each other, how the shape of a flower might fit exactly the tongue of a particular bee, how colors and scents advertised the presence of a nectar, how the whole arrangement was a kind of commerce, the plant offering food in exchange for the service of pollination. And then there was the question that loomed over all of biology, the question of where species came from, why there were so many different forms of life, and why they seemed so perfectly suited to their particular environments. The old answer, that each species was separately created, fixed, and unchanging, was beginning to seem inadequate. There were too many fossils of creatures that no longer lived, too many similarities between different species that suggested relationship rather than independent origin, too many odd details that made sense only if species had histories, if they changed over time. Charles Darwin spent 5 years sailing around the world on the Beagle, and everywhere he went he collected plants, noted their distributions, wondered why certain species were found only in particular places, why islands had their own unique forms, why plants on opposite sides of a mountain range might be so different. He returned to England and began breeding plants, pigeons and orchids and primroses, watching how variation could be selected, how choosing certain individuals to reproduce could, over generations, create forms that were dramatically different from the starting point, and slowly, through years of observation and thought and correspondence with other naturalists, he developed his theory, narration, that species changed over time through natural selection, that random variations occurred, and those variations that helped an organism survive and reproduce would be passed on, while those that hindered would disappear. Plants were central to his thinking. He wrote entire books about climbing plants and insectivorous plants and the movements of plants, documenting the endless ingenuity of adaptation, the way a Venus flytrap could snap shut on an insect in a fraction of a second, the way a tendril could spiral around a support, the way some plants could track the sun across the sky. When On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, it changed everything. Suddenly, the diversity of life had an explanation, a mechanism. Species were not fixed but fluid, shaped by time and circumstance, related to each other through descent from common ancestors. Botanists began to rethink classification, to search for natural groupings based on evolutionary relationships rather than superficial similarities. The goal now was to reconstruct the tree of life, to understand which plants shared recent common ancestors and which had diverged long ago. But even as evolution provided a framework for understanding the diversity of life, it raised a question that Darwin couldn't answer. How were traits passed from parent to offspring? What was the mechanism of inheritance? In a monastery garden in what is now the Czech Republic, an Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel was conducting experiments with pea plants, choosing varieties with clear differences, tall versus short, green seeds versus yellow, wrinkled versus smooth. He cross-pollinated these plants by hand, carefully transferring pollen from one flower to another, then collecting the seeds and planting them, watching what traits appeared in the next generation and the generation after that. What he found was that traits didn't blend. A cross between a tall plant and a short plant didn't produce medium plants. Instead, the offspring were tall, but when these tall plants were bred with each other, some of their offspring were short. The trait for shortness had been hidden, masked by the trait for tallness, but not lost. Mendel worked out mathematical ratios, 3:1, 9:3 to 3:1, patterns that suggested traits were controlled by discrete factors, what we now call genes, factors that came in pairs, one from each parent, and that could be dominant or recessive. He published his work in 1866 in an obscure journal, and almost no one noticed. The paper sat in libraries, unread, unremarked upon, while Mendel returned to his administrative duties and his experiments with bees and his observations of meteorology. It would be 34 years before his work was rediscovered, before three botanists working independently, Hugo de Vries, Karl Correns, Erich von Tschermak, each conducting their own experiments with plant breeding, each coming to similar conclusions, and each finding, when they searched the literature, that Mendel had been there before them. The rediscovery of Mendel's laws in 1900 marked the birth of genetics as a science. Suddenly, there was a mechanism for inheritance, a way to understand how traits were passed on, and eventually how they could change, creating the variation that natural selection worked upon. Botanists began using genetics to understand plant breeding in new ways, to predict the outcomes of crosses, to select for desired traits with greater precision, to understand why some plant varieties bred true, while others produced wildly variable offspring. But the physical basis of heredity remained mysterious. Where exactly were these factors, these genes, located? How did they work? The answer lay in the cell, in the nucleus that Robert Brown had seen decades earlier. Researchers, using ever better microscopes, observed thread-like structures that appeared during cell division, structures that divided and were distributed to daughter cells, chromosomes, and gradually it became clear that chromosomes carried the hereditary material, that genes were arranged along chromosomes like beads on a string, that the behavior of chromosomes during reproduction explained Mendel's ratios, explained why some traits were linked together, passed on as a unit. Thomas Hunt Morgan worked this out using fruit flies, but plant geneticists contributed essential insights, studying maize and tobacco and evening primrose, documenting mutations, tracking the inheritance of traits through multiple generations, building maps that showed the relative positions of genes on chromosomes. Barbara McClintock spent years studying maize chromosomes under the microscope, learning to recognize each individual chromosome by its shape and banding pattern, and she discovered something unexpected, that some genetic elements could move, could jump from one position to another, changing the expression of nearby genes. This was so contrary to the prevailing view that genes were fixed in position on chromosomes that her work was met with skepticism. It would be decades before the importance of these jumping genes, transposable elements, was fully recognized. Meanwhile, the chemistry of plants was being explored in ever greater detail. Scientists were isolating and identifying the compounds that plants produced, not just the familiar substances like sugars and starches, but thousands of other molecules, alkaloids and terpenoids and phenolics, compounds that gave plants their colors and scents, that defended them against herbivores, that attracted pollinators or inhibited the growth of competing plants. The process of photosynthesis was being worked out step by step. Researchers discovered that it happened in special structures within plant cells, chloroplasts, small green organelles packed with membranes. They found that photosynthesis had two stages: light reactions that captured energy from sunlight and used it to split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, and then the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide from the air was fixed into organic molecules, the building blocks of sugars, and all the other compounds the plant needed. Melvin Calvin worked out the details of this cycle, feeding plants radioactive carbon dioxide, then killing them at intervals and analyzing which compounds contained the radioactive carbon, tracing the path of carbon as it was incorporated into increasingly complex molecules. It was intricate work, requiring patience and precision, and when it was complete, it revealed one of the most important chemical processes on Earth, the process that captured the energy that powered nearly all life, that had filled the atmosphere with oxygen billions of years ago, that continued to balance the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen, making the planet habitable. The 20th century brought tools that would have seemed like magic to earlier botanists, machines that could see deeper, measure more precisely, manipulate life itself at scales that were almost incomprehensible. X-ray crystallography revealed the structure of molecules, showing how atoms were arranged in three-dimensional space, and in 1953, when James Watson and Francis Crick worked out the structure of DNA using data from Rosalinda Franklin's crystallographic images, the physical basis of heredity was finally laid bare. DNA was a double helix. Two strands wound around each other, each strand made of a sequence of 4 different bases, and the sequence of these bases encoded information, the instructions for building proteins, for regulating when and where genes were turned on or off, for everything that made one organism different from another. Plant geneticists now had a molecular foundation for their work. They could begin to understand not just that genes existed, but what genes were made of, how they were copied when cells divided, how mutations arose when the copying process made errors, how the information in DNA was translated into the physical reality of leaves and roots and flowers. The field of plant physiology deepened its understanding of how plants sensed and responded to their environments. Researchers discovered that plants had hormones, chemical messengers that coordinated growth and development, auxins that controlled cell elongation, gibberellins that triggered stem growth, cytokinins that promoted cell division, abscisic acid that helped plants respond to stress. These hormones didn't work in isolation. They interacted in complex networks. The same hormone could have different effects depending on concentration, on which tissue it was in, on what other hormones were present. The plant body emerged as a sophisticated system of chemical signaling, constantly adjusting its growth and development in response to conditions. Scientists found that plants could sense light not just to photosynthesize, but to know what time of day it was, what season, whether they were shaded by other plants. They had multiple photoreceptors, proteins that changed shape when struck by specific wavelengths of light, and these changes triggered cascades of responses, affecting which genes were turned on, how the plant grew, when it flowered. The discovery of phytochrome, a photoreceptor that detects red and far red light, helped explain how plants measure day length, how they know when to flower. Some plants needed long days to trigger flowering. Others needed short days, and they measured the length of darkness with precision, using the ratio of different forms of phytochrome as a molecular clock. Plants could sense gravity, touch, temperature, water availability. Each sense had its own receptors, its own signaling pathways, and all of these pathways converged and interacted, allowing the plant to integrate multiple sources of information and produce coordinated responses. When a root tip was touched, cells at the point of a contact produced signals that traveled to other parts of the root, causing it to grow away from the obstacle. When a tendril touched a support, cells on the side of contact stopped elongating, while cells on the opposite side continued to grow, causing the tendril to curl around the support. The plant didn't have a brain, didn't have neurons, but it processed information, made decisions in a distributed way through the collective behavior of cells responding to chemical signals. Ecology matured as a science, moving beyond description to quantitative analysis and experimentation. Plant ecologists measured energy flow through ecosystems, nutrient cycling, competition and facilitation between species. They tracked how plant communities changed over time. Succession, the gradual replacement of one set of species by another as conditions changed. They discovered that plants didn't just respond to their environments, they created environments. A forest changes the light reaching the ground, the temperature, the humidity, the soil chemistry, and these changes determine which other plants can grow there, which animals can live there, what microbes thrive in the soil. The concept of the ecosystem emerged, a community of organisms together with their physical environment, interacting in ways that could be studied and modeled. Energy entering as sunlight, flowing through food webs, dissipating as heat, nutrients cycling through plants and soil and decomposers, and back to plants again. Conservation became urgent as habitats vanished as plant species went extinct before they could even be described. Botanists raced to catalog biodiversity, to understand ecosystems before they disappeared, to identify which species were most at risk, which habitats were most critical to preserve. Seed banks were established, repositories where seeds could be stored in cold, dry conditions, remaining viable for decades or centuries. Insurance against extinction, against the loss of genetic diversity. Thousands of samples carefully cataloged, representing wild species and heritage crop varieties and rare plants from threatened habitats. And then came the tools of molecular biology, restriction enzymes that could cut DNA at specific sequences, allowing researchers to manipulate genes, to move them from one organism to another, to create combinations that had never existed in nature. The first genetically modified plant was created in 1983, a tobacco plant with a bacterial gene inserted into its genome. The gene made the plant resistant to an antibiotic, proof that foreign DNA could be introduced and would function, that the genetic code was universal, that a gene from any organism could potentially work in any other. This opened possibilities that were both exciting and troubling. Crops could be engineered to resist pests, to tolerate herbicides, to produce higher yields, to grow in marginal soils, to contain more nutrients. But there were questions about unintended consequences, about ecological risks, about corporate control of genetic resources, about whether humanity had the wisdom to wield such power responsibly. Disease-resistant papayas saved Hawaii's papaya industry. Golden rice was developed to produce beta-carotene, addressing vitamin A deficiency in regions where rice was a staple, but other modifications were more controversial. Crops designed to work with specific herbicides, raising concerns about increased chemical use, about the evolution of resistant weeds. Sequencing technology improved exponentially, becoming faster, cheaper, just more accessible, and botanists began sequencing entire plant genomes. First, the tiny genome of Arabidopsis thaliana, a small weedy plant that became the laboratory model for plant biology. Then rice, then maize, then hundreds of other species. Each genome was a text written in the four-letter alphabet of DNA, millions or billions of letters long. And within these texts were the instructions for building a plant, for responding to environments, for surviving and reproducing. Comparing genomes revealed evolutionary relationships, showed which genes were conserved across all plants, which were unique to particular lineages, which had been duplicated and modified to take on new functions. Phylogenetics was revolutionized. Instead of relying on visible characteristics that could be misleading, that could evolve independently in different lineages, researchers could compare DNA sequences directly, building family trees based on the accumulation of mutations over millions of years. The plant tree of life was redrawn. Some groups that had seemed closely related based on appearance turned out to be distant cousins. Others that looked nothing alike were revealed to be siblings. The history of plant evolution came into sharper focus. The ancient split between mosses and vascular plants, the later divergence of ferns and seed plants, the relatively recent origin of flowering plants and their explosive diversification, chloroplasts and mitochondria, the organelles that performed photosynthesis and respiration were revealed to have their own small genomes, remnants of their origin as free-living bacteria that had been, I'll engulfed by ancient host cells billions of years ago. Endosymbiosis, a merger that had made complex life possible, that had allowed cells to harness the power of photosynthesis and oxygen metabolism. Climate change became impossible to ignore, and botanists documented its effects. Shifts in flowering times, changes in geographic ranges as species tracked their preferred temperatures northward or upward in elevation, mismatches developing between plants and their pollinators when warming temperatures caused them to respond differently, disruptions cascading through ecosystems. Plants from herbaria collected a century or two earlier became invaluable. Pressed specimens that showed exactly when plants had flowered in the past, where species had grown before the climate changed, providing baselines for comparison, showing how much and how fast things were shifting. Researchers worked to understand how plants would respond to higher carbon dioxide levels, to altered rainfall patterns, to more frequent droughts and heat waves. Some species would benefit, at least initially, growing faster with more carbon dioxide available, but others would struggle, unable to tolerate the heat, unable to compete with invading species from warmer regions. The study of plant stress responses intensified. How did plants survive drought? How did they tolerate salt in the soil, extreme temperatures, poor nutrition? Understanding these mechanisms might allow the development of crops that could withstand harsher conditions, that could feed a growing population on a changing planet. Single-cell sequencing emerged, allowing researchers to analyze individual cells from a plant tissue to see which genes were active in which cell types, revealing that even cells that looked identical under a microscope could be performing very different functions, expressing different sets of genes. The root tip, that small zone of dividing cells pushing through the soil, turned out to contain dozens of distinct cell types, each with its own gene expression profile, each contributing to the coordinated effort of growth and navigation, sensing gravity and moisture and nutrients and obstacles, integrating all this information to determine which direction to grow. CRISPR gene editing arrived, a tool of unprecedented precision, allowing specific changes to be made at specific locations in the genome, not just adding foreign genes, but editing existing ones, correcting mutations, modifying regulatory sequences, creating variations that could then be tested to understand what each gene did, how each element of the genome contributed to the organism's function. The boundary between basic research and application blurred. Understanding how plants worked at the molecular level had immediate practical implications for agriculture, for conservation, for responding to environmental challenges. And through all of this, through centuries of observation and experimentation, of theory and discovery, the plants themselves continued doing what they had always done, converting light to matter, breathing out oxygen, anchoring ecosystems, evolving in response to changing conditions, enduring. The science of botany had grown from simple description to sophisticated analysis, from cataloging diversity to manipulating genes, but in many ways the fundamental questions remained the same. How do plants live? How do they grow and reproduce? How do they interact with their environments and with each other? How did they come to be the way they are? Each answer revealed new depths of complexity, new questions. The more we learned, the more we understood how much remained to learn. How many mysteries still waited in the tissues of a leaf, in the chemistry of a flower, in the silent communication between root and fungus beneath the soil, and yet, standing in that imagined greenhouse as full darkness settles outside, I find myself thinking not about the grand machinery of science, not about genomes and CRISPR and climate models, but about something simpler, something that preceded all the theories and remains when they are set aside. The experience of being near plants, of existing in their presence. There is something that happens in a forest, something that cannot be fully captured in measurements, a quality of light filtered through leaves, the particular silence that comes from being surrounded by living things that make no sound, the way time seems to move differently when the only changes are the slow turning of stems towards sun, the gradual unfurling of a fern frond over days. Indigenous peoples around the world have always known things about plants that science is only beginning to confirm, that trees communicate through fungal networks in the soil, sharing nutrients, sending chemical warnings about pest attacks, that a forest is not a collection of individuals, but a community, interconnected, interdependent, the mycorrhizal networks, the fungal threads that connect root to root, tree to tree, have been called the wood wide web, and the metaphor captures something true. Information flows through these connections. Resources are redistributed. A large tree can support its offspring growing in deep shade, sending them carbon through the fungal links until they are tall enough to reach better light. Plants release volatile, organic compounds into the air when they are attacked by insects, and neighboring plants detect these compounds and activate their own defenses, preparing for attack before it arrives. Some plants can even distinguish between compounds released by their relatives and those from strangers. Responding more strongly to kin, this is communication of a sort, not intentional perhaps, not conscious, but functional, effective. Plants responding to information from their environment, including information from other plants. And there is the mystery of plant intelligence, a phrase that makes some scientists uncomfortable. Intelligence without a brain, without neurons. But what else to call the way a vine navigates a complex environment, extending tendrils in multiple directions, exploring space, making choices about which support to climb, which direction offers the best path upward toward light. The Venus flytrap counts when a trigger hair inside its trap is touched once. Nothing happens, but if the same hair is touched again within 20 seconds, or if a second hair is touched, the trap snaps shut. This prevents the plant from wasting energy on false alarms, on raindrops or wind-blown debris. It waits for the pattern that indicates actual prey, memory of a sort, information stored in the form of electrical and chemical signals, persisting long enough to be combined with new information, to trigger a response only when the right conditions are met. Plants can learn, can be trained through repeated stimuli to stop responding to something harmless. Habituation, the same basic form of learning seen in animals with nervous systems, accomplished through different mechanisms but serving the same function, allowing the organism to allocate resources efficiently to distinguish signal from noise. These discoveries have a way of unsettling the categories we use to organize the world, plant and animal, passive and active, insensate and aware. The boundaries become less clear, not because plants are like animals, but because both are manifestations of something deeper, The problem-solving creativity of evolution, finding solutions to the challenges of survival through whatever materials are available. A plant cannot run from danger, cannot hunt for food, and so it has evolved different strategies, chemical defenses, the ability to regrow from fragments, partnerships with other organisms, timing its reproduction to avoid the worst stresses, storing resources underground, producing thousands of seeds to ensure that some will find suitable conditions. The diversity of these strategies is staggering. Orchids that mimic female wasps to trick males into pollinating them. Pitcher plants that drown and digest insects in pools of enzyme-rich liquid. Strangler figs that germinate in the canopy and send roots down to the ground, eventually enclosing and killing their host tree, taking its place in the forest. Each species is a unique solution to the problem of survival, refined over millions of years, tested against the reality of droughts and floods, of herbivores and pathogens, of competition for light and water and nutrients, and the solutions that worked, persisted, were passed on, were modified by subsequent generations. Walking through a botanical garden, or through any place where plants grow, is to walk through a gallery of evolutionary experiments, each leaf shape optimized for particular light conditions, each root system adapted to particular soil types, each flower structured to attract particular pollinators. And we are only beginning to understand the full extent of what plants do, how they shape the world, how they make it livable for everything else. The oxygen we breathe, all of it was produced by photosynthesis, by cyanobacteria first, billions of years ago, and then by the chloroplasts they became when incorporated into plant cells. Every breath is a gift from ancient and ongoing photosynthesis. The soil beneath our feet, built by plants and the organisms that decompose them, by roots breaking rock, by organic matter accumulating, transforming mineral substrate into the rich medium that supports terrestrial life. The rainforests that stabilize climate, that generate rainfall, that house most of Earth's terrestrial biodiversity, are constructed by plants, their architecture creating habitats, their metabolism driving the cycling of water and carbon and nutrients. Even grassland, seeming simpler, are extraordinarily productive ecosystems, their roots extending deep, storing carbon in the soil, supporting communities of grazers, their seasonal cycles of growth and dormancy, creating a rhythm that countless other species depend upon. Plants are not a background, not decoration, not passive recipients of whatever conditions they encounter. They are primary producers, foundation species, ecosystem engineers, the organisms that make most other terrestrial life possible. And here in this greenhouse that exists half in imagination, half in the accumulated experience of every greenhouse I have ever entered, I think about continuity, about the seeds stored in vaults, about the gardens tended across generations, about the knowledge passed down and built upon. There are trees alive today that were already ancient when the first botanical gardens were planted. When Theophrastus walked through Greek gardens making his observations, when Linnaeus developed his classification system, they have been growing, weathering storms, enduring droughts, producing seeds for longer than human institutions have existed. There are seeds that can remain viable for decades, for centuries, waiting for the right conditions, patient in a way that animals cannot be. And when those conditions arrive, when water and warmth and oxygen reach the embryo inside the seed coat, metabolism resumes, cells divide, a root pushes out, then a shoot, and the whole process begins again. This is what plants do. They persist, they wait, they grow when conditions allow. They produce seeds and spores and fragments that can survive when the parent cannot. They occupy every available niche, from desert to tundra to tropical canopy, from scorching hot springs to freezing mountaintops, from the driest places to lakes and oceans. 490 million years ago, plants moved onto land, greening the continents, transforming the planet, and they have been here ever since, diversifying, adapting, spreading, creating the foundations for everything that followed. We study them, catalog them, manipulate their genes, walk among them, eat them, build with them, breathe the oxygen they produce, and still they remain in some way unknowable, other, living according to rhythms and rules that are not our own. The greenhouse is dark now, the glass panes barely visible, reflecting more than revealing, and inside the plants continue their slow work, their leaves still processing whatever light reaches them, their roots still drawing water from the soil, their cells still dividing, still elongating, still building the structures that will allow them to grow a little more tomorrow, to capture a little more light, to produce a little more biomass. There is no urgency in their growths, no hurry, just the steady accumulation of days, of photons captured and carbon fixed, of water drawn up from roots to leaves and transpired back to the atmosphere, of seasons turning, of the patient unfolding of patterns written into chromosomes millions of years ago and modified slightly with each generation. I think of all the botanists who came before, who looked at plants with wonder and tried to understand, who measured and dissected and classified and experimented, who bred and hybridized and sequenced, who spent careers studying the structure of a single protein, the function of a single gene, the ecology of a single habitat. Each contributed a piece to the vast puzzle, each added to the accumulating knowledge, and yet the puzzle remains incomplete, still growing, still revealing new patterns, new questions. Perhaps it will always be this way. Perhaps the complexity is too great to ever fully comprehend. Too many genes interacting, too many environmental variables, too many levels of organization, from molecules to cells to tissues, to organisms to populations to ecosystems. Or perhaps we will continue to deepen our understanding, finding new tools, asking new questions, seeing patterns we missed before, connecting what seemed unconnected. Either way, the plants will continue, doing what they have always done, growing toward light, extending roots toward water, responding to seasons, reproducing, adapting, evolving, being what they are. And we will continue to watch, to wonder, to study, to try to put into words and equations and models something that ultimately exists beyond our descriptions, in the green reality of chloroplasts converting light to sugar, in the silent communication of roots and fungi, in the opening of a flower at dawn, in the fall of leaves as winter approaches. The greenhouse stands in darkness, holding its collection of lives from around the world. Each plant a small infinity of molecular processes, of genetic information expressed in three-dimensional form, of evolutionary history made manifest in leaf and stem and root, and outside, beyond the glass, The larger world holds billions more, forests and meadows and wetlands, gardens and farms and wild places, all of it green, all of it photosynthesizing, all of it part of the great web of plant life that covers the continents, that makes the world habitable. That has been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. The study of this world, botany, continues in laboratories and field stations, in herbaria and seed banks, in botanical gardens and research forests, carried forward by people who have chosen to spend their lives trying to understand plants, adding their observations to the great accumulation of knowledge, asking the next question, making the next discovery. And the plants themselves, as subjects of all this attention, objects of study and wonder, continue their ancient work, silent, green, alive, converting light to life, breathing out oxygen, building soil, creating habitats, simply being in the way that only plants can be. The darkness is complete now, the greenhouse a shadow against the night sky, and somewhere inside, in the stillness, a seed is germinating, a root is extending, a leaf is preparing to unfold when morning comes, and light returns, as it always does, as it always has, as the earth turns and the cycle continues, endlessly, patiently, green.